Silas Crowder didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the gate like he already owned the land behind it, rode straight up to the porch, and looked down at Clara Whitmore the way a man looks at something he's already decided to take. "Your 60 days are up, widow," he said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "Bank's not renewing. Creek's gonna dry up, same as your options. Sign the paper today, or I'll make sure you lose the cattle and the land." He dropped a folded document at her feet. Didn't hand it, dropped it. And then he smiled. That smile. That was the moment Clara stopped grieving and started fighting. If you were standing in her boots right then, what would you have done? Welcome. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end, because this story gets wilder, deeper, and more surprising than anything you're expecting. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all truly began. The road into Copper Hollow wasn't much of a road. It was more of a suggestion, two ruts pressed into the Kansas prairie by wagon wheels and stubbornness, cutting through grass that grew taller than a man's stirrup on a good rain year and barely reached his boot on a bad one. In the autumn of 1889, it had been a very bad year. The grass was yellow and brittle, the kind that crumbled between your fingers like old paper, and the sky above it had that pale, washed-out look that told experienced men the drought wasn't finished yet. Wade Mercer had been riding through that sky for 4 days. He was 32 years old, though some mornings he felt considerably older. His shoulders carried the particular kind of stiffness that comes not from a single injury, but from thousands of small ones, fence posts driven into frozen ground, saddles cinched at 3 in the morning, hay bales stacked in August heat, until the arms simply forgot how to hang straight. He had a face that was more weathered than handsome, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week and a half, and eyes the color of creek water in late October. Not quite brown, not quite green, the kind of color that didn't commit to anything. That was Wade, more or less. A man who didn't commit to anything. Not because he was dishonest. He wasn't. In 15 years of riding from outfit to outfit across Kansas, Colorado, and the edges of Nebraska, not a single employer had ever questioned his work or his word. He showed up when he said he'd show up. He did the job that needed doing. He left when the season ended, or the money ran out, or the next place called, and he never looked behind him long enough to feel the loss of what he'd left. He told himself for years that was freedom. I was starting to suspect it was something else entirely. The notice he'd pulled off a feed store board in Hays City 3 weeks ago was folded into his breast pocket, creased into softness from being read too many times. Experienced ranch hand needed. Cattle operation, 260 acres. Creek water. Copper Hollow. Ask for C. Whitmore. There was no first name, no description of the work beyond that, no mention of wages, which was either a bad sign or an oversight. Wade had assumed it was an older rancher, a widower, maybe. Someone who'd built a life and now needed help maintaining it. He had not assumed what he actually found. He came over a low rise about 2 miles east of the settlement and saw the ranch below him. A decent-looking spread, he had to admit, better than some he'd hired onto. The house was a proper frame structure, not a soddy, with a covered porch and a stone chimney. The barn needed paint but looked sound. The fence lines were uneven but standing, and threading through the property's southern edge, catching what thin autumn light remained, was the creek. Even from distance, even in drought, he could see it was running, not rushing, but running. That made the land worth considerably more than its appearance suggested. He also noticed the cattle grazing in the near pasture were thin, and the second pasture gate was hanging wrong on its hinge, and the porch step on the east side had a board that had clearly been broken for some time. These were the things Wade Mercer noticed about a property before he noticed anything else. He had a gift for cataloging what was neglected. It was, he supposed, the result of a lifetime spent arriving at other people's problems. He rode down the rise and called out from the gate, the way a man with manners announced himself in those days. "Hello, the house. Looking for C. Whitmore." The woman who came around the side of the barn was not what he expected. She was perhaps 28, though like Wade, she wore her years in a way that made the number feel inadequate. She was carrying a bucket of feed in each hand, her dark hair pinned back under a hat that had seen better years, her dress covered by an apron that showed the morning's work in considerable detail. She stopped when she saw him, set one bucket down with the deliberateness of a woman who was tired but not willing to show it, and looked at him across 30 feet of dirt yard with the kind of direct assessment that most men reserve for horses they were considering purchasing. "You're here about the notice," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Wade Mercer. I've got references from the Double Cross outfit in Dodge, the Harlan spread outside of Ellis, and can you repair a fence post in frozen ground?" He paused. "Yes." "Can you read a ledger?" Another pause. "Well enough." "Have you ever testified in front of a bank officer about the value of a cattle operation?" That stopped him entirely. "Can't say I have." She picked the bucket back up. "Didn't think so." She walked past him toward the barn and said, over her shoulder, "Tie your horse and come inside. I'll put coffee on. This isn't a conversation for the yard." Wade stood at the gate for a moment, hat in hand, trying to figure out what exactly he'd ridden 4 days into. Then he tied his horse and went inside. The kitchen was the warmest room he'd been in since September. Clara Whitmore moved around it with the efficiency of someone who had learned to waste nothing. Not motion, not wood, not words. The coffee was already made, which meant she'd expected someone to come today, or she simply kept coffee ready in the manner of people who have learned that visitors and crises arrive without appointment. She put 2 cups on the table and sat across from him without ceremony. "My husband Thomas died 15 months ago," she said. "Fever took him in 3 days. One of those things you don't see coming, and then it's simply done." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He left me the ranch and a banknote with 60 days left on its extension. The bank manager in town, a man named Prescott, has made it plain he won't renew the loan with me as the sole operator. He says a woman alone is too great a risk on 260 acres. Wade didn't say anything. He was listening the way he listened to horses, not to the words, but to what was underneath them. "Prescott's not the only problem," Clara continued. Her voice stayed steady. He noticed she was working to keep it that way. "Silas Crowder owns the property to the north and east. He's been after this land for 3 years, since before Thomas died. He wants the creek, controls that water, controls every ranch downstream for 7 miles. He's made 3 formal purchase offers and 2 that weren't so formal." She looked up from her coffee. "Last month he rode in here and told me I'd be better off selling before winter, because winter alone would change my mind even if he didn't." "He threatened you directly?" "He dropped a purchase agreement at my feet and told me my 60 days were up." A pause. He smiled when he did it. Wade felt something tighten in his jaw. He didn't say anything about it. "I need someone who can talk to Prescott at the bank," Clara said. "A man whose name can go on the refinancing paperwork alongside mine. Someone who knows cattle well enough that they can't be caught out when the questions get technical." She leveled her eyes at him with a steadiness that made him sit up slightly straighter without quite knowing why. "And I need someone honest, because the arrangement I'm about to propose would give them considerable power over everything I've built, and if they were dishonest, I'd have no way to stop them from using it." Wade set his cup down carefully. "What arrangement?" Clara Whitmore did not look away. "I need a husband," she said, "a legal business partner whose standing can help me keep this ranch. I am offering you a home, fair wages, and partial ownership of the property, 10% immediately, with more to follow as we build the operation. In return, I need hard work, complete honesty, and your commitment to stand beside me when things get difficult." A breath. "And they will get difficult." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind came through the gap under the door and moved across the floor like cold water. Wade heard himself say, "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since the morning after Crowder dropped that paper at my feet." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. "You don't know me," he said. "I know you rode 4 days for a job you had no guarantee was real," Clara replied. "I know you noticed the hanging gate and the broken porch step before you'd been in my yard 3 minutes. I know your references are from 2 solid outfits, and you've been in this territory long enough to know who's worth working for." A slight pause. "I also know you're not wearing a wedding ring, and you have the look of a man who has spent a long time belonging to nobody." That landed somewhere Wade hadn't expected it to land. He looked at his hands on the table, calloused, scarred across the left knuckle, where a fence wire had caught him badly 3 winters ago. The hands of a man who had done an enormous amount of work on other people's property. "You're asking a stranger to marry you," he said, flat, just naming it. I'm asking a qualified man to enter a legal partnership that includes marriage because the bank and the law both require a husband's signature to make the refinancing possible. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to love me, Mr. Mercer. I'm asking you to be honest and to work. And if I decide to leave in 6 months, then you leave with your wages and your 10% stake, which will be worth real money if we do the work right. She paused. But I don't think you'll leave. Why not? Clara tilted her head slightly. Because you've been leaving your whole life and you rode 4 days to get here. That tells me you're looking for a reason to stop. Wade Mercer sat with that for a long moment. It was, he had to admit, the most accurate thing anyone had said to him in years. What time is sunrise? He asked finally. Clara looked at him with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief. It was something more careful than either of those things. About 6. Then I'll have my answer for you by 6, he said. He stood, picked up his hat, and walked outside into the cold Kansas evening. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the ground with his back against the barn wall and his horse standing near enough that he could hear the animal breathe, and he let the stars wheel overhead the way they did when a man had nothing between him and the sky. And he thought about what Clara Whitmore had laid on that kitchen table as plainly as another woman might have laid out bread. He thought about the Harlan spread, where he'd worked 2 winters and done a solid job and been paid fairly and ridden away in March without a backward look. He thought about the Double Cross, where he'd spent 13 months learning more about cattle than he'd known in the previous decade, and where old Jim Bridwell had shaken his hand the last morning and said, "You're the best fence man I've ever employed, son. You ought to find yourself a place and stay put." He thought about all the fences he had built, and all the barns he had slept in, and all the roads he had ridden away on, and he tried to count the years and found that the years didn't arrange themselves into anything that resembled a life so much as a long list of departures. He was 32 years old. He owned a horse, a saddle, 2 changes of clothes, a good rope, and about $40 in cash. He had references from men who valued his work. He had no address. The sky lightened toward 5 o'clock and turned that particular pale gray that comes before color returns to the world, and Wade pushed himself up from the ground, brushed the dirt from his coat, and walked across the yard to the porch. Clara was already up. The kitchen light was burning. He knocked. She opened the door and looked at him without expression, waiting. "Yes," he said. Something moved across her face, not joy, not relief, not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated than any of those things. It was the look of a woman who had made a very large bet and would not know for a long time whether she had been wise or simply desperate. "Come in then," she said. "Coffee's hot." He stepped through the door. For the first time in 15 years, he did not have the sensation of a road pulling him forward. He had the sensation, unfamiliar and slightly frightening, of having arrived. They married 4 days later in Copper Hollow, in the presence of the Justice of the Peace and 2 witnesses, the general store owner and his wife, who had known Clara since before Thomas Whitmore died, and regarded the whole arrangement with the mixture of sympathy and skepticism that small towns reserve for unusual events. The ceremony was brief. The words were the standard ones. Wade said them without stumbling. Clara said them in a clear, steady voice that reminded him of the way she'd laid out the whole proposition at that kitchen table. Not cold, but controlled, because control was what the situation required, and she had long since learned the difference between what you felt and what the moment asked of you. There was no celebration afterward. They drove back to the ranch in silence, and by the time the wagon reached the gate, Wade had already started making a mental list of everything that needed doing before the first snow. The broken porch step, the hanging gate, the thinness of the cattle, and somewhere in the back of Thomas Whitmore's record books, waiting to be found, a problem that neither of them knew about yet. One that Silas Crowder had apparently been aware of for a very long time, the kind of problem that could take everything. The first morning as a married couple, they didn't speak much at breakfast. That wasn't unusual. Wade had spent enough years in bunkhouses and camp kitchens to know that the men who talked the most at breakfast were usually the ones with the least to do, and Clara Whitmore, Clara Mercer now, though neither of them had tested that name aloud yet, was clearly not a woman who filled silence for the sake of filling it. She put eggs and biscuits on the table, sat down, and ate with the focused economy of someone who had a long day already mapped out in her head and didn't want conversation interrupting the map. Wade ate and looked around the kitchen the way he looked at everything, cataloging, measuring, noting. The shelves were organized but sparse. The wood box beside the stove was less than half full, which meant someone needed to split wood before the week was out, or the mornings would get mean. There was a crack running along the plaster above the east window that had been patched twice with different materials, neither patch quite matching, which told him the roof above that corner had leaked at some point, and probably still did when the rain came from the right direction. The iron pan hanging above the stove had a handle wrapped in wire where the original wood grip had broken off, the kind of repair a person makes when they're managing alone and don't have time to ride into town for a replacement. These were the things that told a story without words. A woman who had been doing the work of two people for 15 months on a narrowing budget, patching what she could, deferring what she couldn't, holding it together by the kind of sustained daily effort that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but will eventually exhaust even the strongest person. Wade thought about that while he finished his coffee. "I'd like to start with the ledgers today," he said, when Clara stood to clear the plates. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Not suspicious, exactly. More like a person checking the weight of something before they commit to carrying it. "Thomas kept them in the desk in the front room," she said. 3 books. The oldest goes back to when he first bought the property. "I'll need all 3. She nodded once and left the room. When she came back, she set 3 ledger books on the table. Worn covers, swollen with use, the pages of the oldest book brown at the edges, from years of being handled with work-dirtied hands. Wade pulled them toward him and opened the first one. "I'll also need the original deed," he said, without looking up, "and any survey documents you have, and the current loan papers from Prescott at the bank." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Why the survey?" Something in her voice made him look up. It wasn't a defensive question. It was the question of a woman who had already wondered the same thing herself and hadn't liked where the wondering led. "Because if Crowder wants this property badly enough to drop papers at your feet and ride away smiling," Wade said, "there's a reason. Men like Crowder don't want what they can't use. He wants the creek. If he's been trying for 3 years and hasn't gotten it, either he's patient or he's waiting for something specific to become useful." He paused. "I want to know what he's waiting for." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to the back bedroom and came back with a tin box. She set it on the table beside the ledgers and opened it herself, pulling out documents and laying them flat. "I've looked through all of this," she said. "After Thomas died, I didn't find anything that seemed wrong." "You weren't looking for the same thing I'm looking for," Wade said. He meant it practically, not as a criticism. She received it that way, which told him something useful about her. She left him to it and went outside to start the morning's work, and Wade Mercer sat down with 3 ledger books, a property deed, a survey document dated 1881, and a loan agreement that had enough conditions written into its margins to give a careful reader pause, and he began to read. He read for 4 hours without stopping. The eggs from breakfast sat like lead in his stomach by the second hour. Not from any fault of the cooking, but from the particular tension that builds in a person's chest when they begin to understand that a situation is more complicated than they originally agreed to enter. The ledgers themselves were solid. Thomas Whitmore had been a methodical man. Not brilliant, but careful. He recorded everything: purchase dates, cattle counts, well outputs, fence repair costs, what he paid for hay in a dry year versus a wet one. Wade could read a ranch's health through its books the way a doctor read a patient's color. And what these books told him was that Thomas Whitmore had run a decent, honest operation that was perpetually one bad season away from the edge. Not because he was careless, because the margins were simply that thin. One drought, one bad calf year, one injury that kept a man off his horse for 6 weeks. Any single thing could tip the balance. And apparently the fever that killed Thomas Whitmore in 3 days had been that single thing. The loan from Prescott's bank had been manageable when Thomas was alive. It became unmanageable the moment Clara was alone, not because the numbers changed, but because Prescott changed what he was willing to accept. Wade had seen that before. Banks were not institutions in the way people imagined them. They were the opinions of the men who ran them, dressed up in the language of policy. But none of that was what snagged his attention. What snagged his attention was a single line, written in Thomas Whitmore's careful hand, near the back of the second ledger book, dated about 2 years before his death. Spoke to Hendricks about the south boundary. He believes the 1881 survey May have run the creek line wrong, possibly placed marker stone 30 to 40 feet east of true position. Told me not to say anything until he can confirm. Said if the boundary is where he thinks it is, Crowder's claim on the East Bend has no standing. Hendricks was nervous about it. Haven't heard from him since. Wade read that 3 times. Then he sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. Hendricks. No first name. No indication of who he was or what capacity he'd been operating in. Surveyor, neighbor, county official. Just a name and a nervousness, and then silence. Wade thought about Silas Crowder dropping that purchase agreement at Clara's feet. He thought about the way Crowder had smiled. He picked up the 1881 survey document and spread it flat on the table, holding the corners down with the salt shaker and a coffee cup. He was not a surveyor. He had never claimed to be. But he'd worked enough ranch land in his life to read a survey map well enough to follow the boundaries. And what he saw when he looked at this one was that the creek marker stones were positioned in a way that, if you moved them 30 to 40 feet in any direction, could change which portion of the creek fell inside which boundary. The deepest, most reliable bend of that creek, the part that would still be running even in the worst drought years, sat right at the eastern edge of Clara's property according to the 1881 survey. If the survey was wrong, that bend might be further inside her boundary than anyone currently believed, or it might be outside it entirely. Wade folded the survey carefully and put it back in the tin box. He didn't say anything to Clara that evening, not because he was hiding it from her. He would tell her, but not until he understood it better. The worst thing he could do right now was hand her a half-formed problem and watch her spend the night carrying it when they both needed to be functional in the morning. What he did instead was walk the property. He told her he wanted to check the fence lines before dark, which was true, and he did check them, but he also walked to the creek and followed it east along the boundary until the light gave out. Looking at the placement of the marker stones and the lay of the land, memorizing the geography the way a man memorizes a face he expects to need to recognize later. The creek was lower than it should have been, but still running, moving through a wide, shallow bed until it hit the east bend and deepened suddenly, pooling in a wide curve that was clearly spring-fed from below. Even in this drought, that pool was knee-deep. In a wet year, it would be something else entirely. Wade stood at the marker stone on the east boundary for a long time. He looked at where it sat. He looked at the tree line beyond it. He looked at the pool. Then he turned and walked back to the house in the dark, his boots finding the path by feel. The meeting with Prescott at the bank happened 3 days later, on a Thursday morning when the wind had a teeth-in-it quality that came off the prairie like a personal insult. Clara had dressed carefully, which Wade noticed without commenting on. She wore a dark dress that was her best one. Not fancy, nothing about Clara's wardrobe was fancy, but clean and pressed and carrying itself with a quiet dignity that some women achieved with expensive cloth and others achieved with something that had nothing to do with what they were wearing. Clara was the second kind. Wade wore his better shirt and his good hat and had shaved that morning for the first time since before the wedding, which Clara also noticed without commenting on, though he caught her glance when he came to the breakfast table, and there was something in it that might have been the faint beginning of reassessment. Prescott's bank occupied a solid brick building on Copper Hollow's Main Street, the most substantial structure in town, which said something about where the real power in a small settlement tended to sit. Prescott himself was a man of about 50, with the particular well-fed solidity of someone who had spent decades making decisions other people had to live with. He had a careful handshake and careful eyes, and the practiced neutral expression of a man who had delivered bad news often enough to develop a professional relationship with it. He had clearly expected Clara to come alone. When she walked in with Wade beside her, something shifted behind Prescott's careful eyes. He covered it quickly, but Wade saw it, and he filed it away. "Mrs. Whitmore," Prescott said, starting to rise. "Mrs. Mercer," Clara said, quietly, with precision. Prescott looked at Wade. "Wade Mercer," Wade said, extending his hand. "Clara's husband. We married last week." He shook Prescott's hand with the particular firmness that said, "I have done physical work every day of my adult life, and I'm not nervous in your office. We're here to discuss refinancing the operating loan. I've had a chance to go through the ranch's books and the property documents. I think the numbers will answer your questions." They sat. Prescott asked his questions. Wade answered them. Not all of them, and not always immediately. He was careful not to perform certainty he didn't have, because Prescott was the kind of man who tested for false confidence and would find it if it was there. But the questions about cattle numbers, well output, fence conditions, projected herd weight by spring, those Wade answered from 4 days of walking and observing. And he answered them in the direct, unadorned way of someone who had learned the ranch by living on it rather than by reading about it, which was exactly the impression he needed to create. Prescott kept looking at Clara between questions. Not rudely. Assessing. Trying to figure out the nature of the arrangement from the outside, which he couldn't quite do because there was nothing false on the surface to detect. At one point he asked, "How long have you been acquainted with the Whitmore property, Mr. Mercer?" "Since last week," Wade said. A pause from Prescott. "And you feel confident speaking to its financial standing after 1 week?" "I feel confident speaking to what I've seen and measured," Wade said. "If there's a specific number you'd like to check against what I've told you, I'd encourage you to send someone out. The counts will match." It was the right answer. It was the answer of a man who wasn't performing, who was instead inviting verification, which was different and considerably harder to argue with. Prescott looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded and pulled out the refinancing paperwork. On the walk back to the wagon, Clara didn't say anything for nearly a block. The wind was pushing hard from the north, and she held her hat with one hand and looked straight ahead. "How did you know all of that?" she said finally. "I read your husband's ledgers for 4 hours," Wade said, "and I walked every corner of the property twice." "Nobody's walked every corner of that property since Thomas died." "I noticed." He glanced at her. "The west fence has 3 posts that'll pull out of the ground by January. The near pasture's been overgrazed and needs to rest this winter. And the second well has a loose rock at the casing that'll be a problem if it freezes before we address it." Clara walked for a moment. "You made a list." "I always make a list." She looked at him sideways, and there was something in her expression that was more complicated than gratitude and less simple than surprise. It was the look of a person beginning to understand that the thing they had arranged was going to be different from what they had imagined, and not knowing yet whether different was going to mean better or worse. "The bank will refinance," Wade said, because she hadn't asked, but was clearly waiting to see if he'd say it. "You're sure?" "Pretty sure." Prescott wasn't expecting a man who'd done his homework. That changed the conversation. Clara was quiet another moment. Thomas used to say Prescott was a fair man who happened to make unfair decisions. Wade thought about that. Probably both things are true. The loan came through 9 days later, at terms that were manageable if the ranch performed as Wade had projected. Clara stood at the kitchen table and read the letter twice, and then she sat down, and for a moment she put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. And Wade understood that she was doing what people do when something they've been holding together through sheer will suddenly doesn't require the same level of holding. The muscles relax, and the exhaustion that was always underneath the effort becomes briefly visible. He didn't comment on it. He put the kettle on and made tea, which he didn't particularly like, because it was the thing that seemed called for, and left the cup at her elbow without ceremony. She picked it up. After a while she said, "I didn't think he'd do it." "Prescott?" "Any of it." She set the cup down. "Refinance, accept new terms. I'd already been told no twice." "You went alone those times." A long silence. "Yes," she said. "I did." Wade didn't push on it. What needed to be understood between them had been understood. He refilled his own cup and sat back down and pulled the second ledger toward him again, because he had been turning Thomas Whitmore's note about the survey over in his mind for 9 days now, and he'd made a decision. "I need to tell you something," he said. Clara looked up. In less than 2 weeks, he'd already learned to read the quality of her attention. She had 2 kinds. The surface kind she gave to things that required management, and the full kind she gave to things that mattered. She switched to the full kind now. He told her about the note in the second ledger. He told her exactly what Thomas had written and exactly what it might mean. He told her about his walk along the creek and the marker stone, and his observation of where the deep pool sat relative to the boundary line. He watched her face while he talked. She didn't interrupt. She didn't change expression much, but her knuckles went white around the teacup, just slightly, which told him what he needed to know about how much she'd been worrying about something she didn't have a name for yet. "Crowder mentioned the survey to you," Wade said. It wasn't a question. She looked up sharply. "Last spring." He rode by when I was mending the east fence and said something about how boundary disputes could get complicated, and that it was something I should consider when thinking about his offer. She paused. I didn't know what he meant. I thought he was just trying to make me nervous. He was, but he was also telling you that he knew something. Wade set his coffee down. He's been waiting for the right moment to use it. A disputed boundary becomes leverage when the person on the wrong side of it is vulnerable. He thought I was vulnerable. He thought you were alone, Wade said, which is different, though I understand why he assumed they were the same thing. Clara held his gaze for a moment. There was something in her expression he couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't warmth exactly, and it wasn't gratitude exactly, and it was something more careful and more earned than either of those simpler things. What do you want to do about the survey? She asked. I want to hire an independent surveyor, someone from outside this county who doesn't know Crowder and doesn't owe Prescott anything. He leaned forward slightly. If Thomas's note is right, and the original survey placed the marker stone wrong, the corrected boundary could put that whole East Bend solidly inside our property. If it does, Crowder loses his primary argument for the purchase. He loses the leverage he's been sitting on for 3 years. And if the corrected survey goes the other way? Wade didn't look away. Then we deal with that when we know it. Clara considered this. She was not a woman who made decisions quickly, he'd learned. She made them thoroughly. Can we afford an outside surveyor? I've been taking notes on the operating costs, he said. If we defer the second well repair until spring, and I do the west fence posts myself instead of hiring extra hands, we can cover it. You said the second well repair can't wait. The full repair can't. I can stabilize the casing rock myself before the freeze. That buys us until spring. He paused. It'll mean a couple of mornings at the well in cold weather. Clara looked at him. You already planned this out. I think in lists, he said. I told you. She almost smiled. Almost. It pulled at the corner of her mouth and then went back where it had come from, as if she wasn't quite ready to let it out all the way yet. Write to the surveyor, she said. I'll tell you where Thomas's original land documents are. The surveyor's name was Arthur Gell, out of Hayes City, and he came recommended by a county clerk Wade had written to without explaining precisely why he needed someone from outside the region. Gell was a small man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of talking to himself under his breath while he worked, which Wade found more reassuring than otherwise. Men who muttered at their instruments were usually men who took their instruments seriously. He came on a cold morning in early November and spent 2 full days on the property, measuring, referring to his own instruments rather than the original markers, making notes in a cramped hand that only he could clearly read. Wade followed him through most of it, not hovering, giving the man room to work, but present. Clara came out on the second afternoon when Gell was working along the East Creek boundary and stood back a distance and watched without saying anything, her arms crossed and her hat pulled low against the wind. Gell packed up at the end of the second day and sat at the kitchen table with his notes spread before him and told them what he'd found. The original survey was wrong, not dramatically wrong, 31 feet at the critical point, which didn't sound like much until Gell placed his finger on the corrected map and showed them exactly which 31 feet they were talking about. The deep pool, the spring-fed bend, the most reliable water source in the property's southern half. All of it, every bit of it, fell inside the corrected boundary. Clara was very still. Wade looked at the map for a long time. How confident are you? He asked. I staked it 3 times with different reference points, Gell said. He had the slightly defensive tone of a man who had been asked to confirm findings that seemed too convenient to be true. The original survey ran the line off a reference marker that was itself incorrectly placed. I found the original government township pin under 14 inches of soil. The position is not ambiguous. You can document that, Wade said. Already done. I can have it filed with the county clerk by Friday. Wade looked at Clara. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that didn't have a clean name. Not celebration exactly, because they both understood what this finding was going to mean, and it wasn't going to be simple. It was more like the particular feeling of a door opening into a room you'd been trying to reach for a long time, and understanding in the same moment that the room has its own dangers that you couldn't see from the doorway. File it, Wade said. Gell nodded and began gathering his papers. After he left, Clara stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking at the creek in the distance. Crowder is going to know, she said. Yes. And he's not going to accept it quietly. No, Wade agreed. He won't. He was already thinking about the west fence, about the sight lines from the ridge to the north, about the 2 months of drought that had left the grass brittle and dry from the eastern pasture all the way to the creek bank, about how much damage a fire could do on a night when the wind came from the north and a man had reason to want the Mercer ranch to disappear before a corrected survey could be made permanent. He didn't say any of that to Clara. Not yet. Instead, he walked outside and looked at the sky, which was clear and cold and entirely unhelpful, the way skies tend to be when the problems below them are human problems. And he calculated how many days they had before Gell reached the county clerk's office, and the corrected survey became a matter of public record. 4 days. Maybe 5. He went back inside and told Clara he was going to check the water levels in the stock tank before dark. He did check them. But on the way back, he stopped at the barn and looked at what firefighting tools they had on hand, and he began quietly, methodically, to move them to places where they could be reached quickly in the dark. It was the kind of preparation a man made when he couldn't prove something was coming, but felt it in the particular way that 15 years of learning hard country had taught him to trust. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't know yet exactly how little time he had. 2 days after Gell left, Silas Crowder rode up to the western fence line. He didn't come to the house this time. He sat his horse at the fence and waited, which was a different kind of message than riding in uninvited. This was the message of a man who had decided to make you come to him. Wade saw him from the yard and felt something tighten in his chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. It was the specific sensation of recognizing that the thing you've been preparing for has arrived and is standing at your fence, wearing a patient expression. He walked out to the fence line alone. Crowder was perhaps 55, big through the shoulders, with a gray mustache and the kind of easy confidence that came from having more land and more men and more money than most of the people he dealt with. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to conversations ending the way he wanted them to end. Mercer, he said, like he'd known Wade's name for years. Crowder, Wade said. Hear you had a surveyor out here. He said it the way someone mentions the weather. Casual, as if it cost him nothing to know it. Word travels fast, Wade said. In a small county it does. Crowder looked past Wade toward the house, toward the creek beyond it. Thought you might want to talk before things got complicated. Things got complicated when you dropped a purchase agreement at a widow woman's feet and rode off smiling, Wade said. Even. Not angry. Just naming it. Something moved across Crowder's face. Not shame, not exactly. Something more like the brief recalibration a man makes when the person across from him doesn't behave as predicted. That was business, Crowder said. Sure, Wade said. This is too. Crowder looked at him for a moment. The original survey has stood for 8 years. Original survey was wrong, Wade said. Our surveyor has documentation. We're filing with the county clerk this week. County clerks have been known to lose paperwork. Wade held his eyes. I imagine they have. But our copies won't get lost. And Gell's working record won't get lost. And if something happens to the filing, the story of what happened to it is going to get considerably more attention than Gell's survey report by itself ever would. He leaned one hand on the fence post, not aggressively, just comfortably, the way a man leans on a fence on his own property. You know how small towns work, Crowder. You've lived in this county longer than I have. People start talking about what might have happened to county paperwork. That conversation ends up places you don't want it. Crowder was quiet for a long moment. You're smarter than I figured you for, he said finally. Most people are when they've got something worth fighting for, Wade said. Crowder looked at him, a long, measuring look, the look of a man revising an estimate. Then he turned his horse without another word and rode north along the fence line, unhurried, as if the conversation had been entirely on his terms. Wade watched him go. His hand on the fence post was steady. His chest was not, but that was between him and the fence post, and neither of them was going to mention it. He walked back to the house. Clara was in the doorway. She'd seen the whole thing. What did he say? She asked. Nothing he meant to say out loud, Wade said. But enough. He went inside, and that night he moved the firebreak tools to the edge of the western pasture, where the grass was driest and the wind came hardest from the north. And he didn't sleep more than an hour at a stretch. Because Silas Crowder had ridden away too calmly for a man who had just been told he'd lost the argument he'd spent 3 years building. And in Wade's experience, when a man like that went quiet, it was because he'd already decided what he was going to do instead of talking. The night stayed dark. The grass stayed dry. The wind kept coming from the north, steady and cold and indifferent, the way it always did out here, not caring what it fed, not caring what it took, just moving through everything the way it always had and always would. Wade lay in the dark and listened to it. He was still listening when, at 4:17 in the morning, he smelled smoke. He was out of bed before his eyes were fully open. That was the thing about smelling smoke at 4 in the morning in a drought year. The body understood what the mind was still catching up to, and the body moved. Wade was pulling his boots on before he'd consciously registered what had woken him, and he was out the back door and into the yard before the cold hit him fully. And then the cold didn't matter because what he saw to the west made every other sensation irrelevant. The horizon was orange, not the pale, creeping orange of a sunrise. This was a low, violent glow sitting close to the earth, the kind of color that had no business being in the sky at 4 in the morning, and it was moving. Even from the yard, he could see the way it shifted and pulsed, eating the darkness in uneven pulses, and the wind, that same north wind he'd been listening to all night, was pushing it south and east, toward the herd, toward the barn, toward the house. He was back inside in 3 seconds. "Clara." He put his hand on her shoulder and shook once, firm. "Fire in the west pasture. Get up now." She was already sitting up. She had the look of someone who had never slept deeply enough in the past 15 months to be genuinely surprised by a crisis arriving in the night. "How bad?" she said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "Bad enough that we don't have time to talk about how bad." He was already moving toward the back door. "I'm getting the horses. Get dressed and bring everything from the barn we can use to cut a fire break. The heavy plow, the spare shovels, the wet burlap sacks I put behind the water barrel last week." He heard her hit the floor running before he reached the yard. Outside, the orange on the horizon had grown. 3 minutes, maybe 4, since he'd first opened his eyes, and already it was larger, which told him the fire had been burning for some time before the wind shifted enough to carry the smell to the house. It hadn't started recently. It had been set, and then it had been left to build, and someone had calculated exactly how long it would take for a sleeping couple to notice it and how much ground it would have covered by then. Wade didn't let himself think about who had done that calculation. Not yet. He got both horses saddled in a time that would have been impossible if he hadn't been putting in the hours on the ranch and hadn't known every buckle and strap in that barn by touch in the dark. And he led them out into the yard just as Clara came out of the house carrying one of the shovels and her good work gloves, her hair not yet pinned, her boots only half-laced. "The plow," he said. "Already moved it to the hitching rail last night," she said, slightly breathless, catching the reins he tossed to her. "You put it there yourself." He had. He'd forgotten he had. The preparation from 2 nights ago. The quiet rearrangement of tools he'd done while telling himself he was probably wrong about what was coming. It was going to matter now in ways that felt more like luck than foresight. Clara swung up onto her horse without slowing down, which he noticed and filed away for later, and they rode for the western pasture at a pace that the darkness and the uneven ground technically argued against, but that neither of them reduced. The fire was louder than Wade had expected. That was the thing people who hadn't been near a grass fire didn't understand. It had a sound, a low, irregular roar that mixed with the crackle of individual stalks, and the occasional sharp report of something denser catching, and underneath all of it the wind that was feeding it, constant and indifferent. The sound meant it was eating fast. The drought-killed grass was giving it almost nothing to resist. He pulled up at the edge of the south pasture and looked at what they were dealing with. The fire's leading edge was maybe 300 yards west, moving east-southeast at the pace of the wind, which was not running speed but was faster than comfortable walking. Between the fire and the house, there was approximately 250 acres of dry grass, the western fence, the barn, and the cattle. The cattle were already moving. Wade could hear them. A confused rising sound, the particular noise of animals that have smelled something wrong and are starting to understand that wrong means danger. They were in the near pasture, the south one, which was actually the better situation. It put the creek between them and the fire if they could be moved east before the flames cut off that route. "I need to move the herd," Wade said. They have to get to the creek pasture before the fire gets between us. The fire break, Clara said. She was looking at the orange glow with the expression of someone doing math that didn't have good answers. We need a line wide enough to stop it before it reaches the barn. He looked at the geography, at the angle of the fire's movement, at the fence lines, at where the ground was lowest and therefore the grass thinnest. There. He pointed to a line running roughly northwest to southeast across the western portion of the property, following a slight natural depression in the terrain. If we can plow a strip along that line, maybe 30 feet wide, we've got a chance. The ground's lower there. The grass is a little less dry. It won't stop everything, but it'll slow it. One plow, Clara said. One plow. She looked at him. In the orange light from the west, her face was all shadow and amber, unreadable in the details but clear in the main thing. She was not panicking. She was frightened, which was the appropriate response to the situation, but she was thinking inside the fear rather than being consumed by it. I'll take the plow, she said. You get the cattle. Clara, I know how to run a plow, Wade. Thomas and I broke 40 acres of this ground ourselves before we ever had a hired hand. She held his gaze. You can move 100 head faster on horseback than I can. The math is simple. She wasn't wrong. He hated that she wasn't wrong. If the fire gets ahead of the plow line, he said, you don't try to finish it. You get on your horse and you ride to the creek. You understand? I understand, she said. I need you to mean that. Something crossed her face, frustration and something underneath it that was more complicated. I mean it, she said. Go. He went. Moving spooked cattle in the dark, with one horse and no help, was the kind of work that required a specific division of the mind. One part operating the horse and reading the herd's movement, another part tracking the fire's advance in the peripheral vision, and a third part that had to stay completely calm even as the first two parts were running at full speed. Wade had done it before, in different circumstances, and he defaulted now to the wordless, pressureless technique that experienced hands used with frightened animals. No sudden movements, no shouting, just steady pressure on the sides and rear of the herd, guiding rather than chasing, asking the cattle to move in the direction that happened to be away from the fire. Cattle had their own intelligence about fire. They could smell it, and they wanted away from it, which meant Wade's job was primarily to ensure that the direction they wanted to go was the direction he needed them to go. The gate to the creek pasture was already open. He'd opened it in the first 2 minutes, before he started working the herd, and he spent the next 40 minutes doing the kind of riding that wasn't exciting to watch, and wasn't dramatic in any clean sense, but was exhausting in the way only sustained, precise work can be exhausting. 73 head, all told. He counted as they went through the gate, keeping the number in his head the way you keep a number when you know you're going to need to account for it later. 71 through 72. A heifer was hung up at the corner of the fence, confused by the angle of the gate, pushing against the fence posts instead of through the opening. Wade rode around her patiently, cut off her retreat, and worked her back toward the gate without raising her panic further. She went through. 73. He latched the gate and turned his horse west and looked at what was happening. The fire had advanced considerably in the time it had taken him to move the herd. The leading edge was closer to 150 yards now, rather than 300, and it had widened as it moved, consuming the western fence line entirely and spreading north along the property edge. The orange had gone from a glow to an active wall, tall enough that he could see individual curtains of flame standing up in the wind before the gusts folded them back down into the grass. And in the moving light, he could see something else. 2 riders on the ridge to the north, sitting their horses, watching. Wade felt his jaw tighten. He didn't move toward them immediately because there was no strategic value in it right then, and because the fire break was more important than making a point. But he looked at them, memorized the position, the silhouettes, the fact that there were 2 and not 1, and then he turned his horse south to find Clara Shab. She had the plow moving. He heard it before he saw it. The particular grinding sound of iron working through dry earth, not the rich tearing sound of good spring plowing, but a harder, more reluctant sound, the noise of soil that had been baked dry and didn't particularly want to be opened up. The plow horse was struggling. Wade could see that in the animal's movement, even at distance, the head down, the hind legs working harder than the front, the kind of effort that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Clara was walking behind the plow, handles gripped, her whole weight thrown against the resistance of the rig, the kind of work that turned arms to rubber after 20 minutes, and that she had apparently been doing for most of the time he'd been moving cattle. The line she'd cut was not long enough. It wasn't even close to long enough. There was maybe 100 feet of bare earth behind her, and she was perhaps 2/3 of the way to the natural depression he'd identified, which meant she had another 150 feet minimum before she reached the point where the fire break might actually function. And the fire was close enough now that the light was casting real shadows across the pasture, and the heat was something you could feel if the wind shifted your direction. Wade rode up alongside her and looked at the math. The math was bad. The leading edge of the fire was going to reach the incomplete fire break line in approximately 20 minutes, possibly less. Clara could not plow 150 feet of resistant soil in 20 minutes with a tiring horse. The physics were simply not available. He pulled up and looked north at the ridge. The two riders were still there, and something shifted in the way Wade Mercer thought about the next 20 minutes. He had been running the problem as a physics problem. Fire versus fire break, distance versus time, one woman versus 150 feet of dry earth. But there was another element in the equation that he'd been setting aside because it wasn't the immediate emergency. It was the reason for the immediate emergency. The two men on the ridge were there because someone wanted the Mercer ranch to burn before a corrected survey could be permanently filed. If the barn went, the house went, the cattle were lost in the chaos, the financial position collapsed. The whole thing unraveled the way Silas Crowder had been patiently waiting for it to unravel. But the corrected survey had already been filed. Jell had submitted it to the county clerk 2 days ago. Wade had ridden to town himself to confirm the filing and had held the receipt in his hands. Which meant the fire, if it succeeded in burning the ranch down tonight, accomplished exactly nothing for Crowder. The boundary was recorded. The creek was theirs by documented survey. No amount of property damage changed that now. The men on the ridge didn't know that. Wade turned his horse north and rode toward the ridge at a pace that said he was not running away from anything. He reached the base of the ridge in 4 minutes and started up it, and the two riders at the top watched him come without moving. That told him something. If they'd been confident in their position, they'd have ridden off before he got close. The fact that they stayed meant either they were bold, or they were stupid, or they'd been given standing orders about what to do if someone came to them. He pulled up about 30 feet below them and looked up. They were both younger than he'd expected. The one on the left was perhaps 25, with a flat expression that was either genuine calm or performed calm. Wade couldn't tell at this distance. The one on the right was older, maybe 35, with the kind of face that had learned to show nothing and hadn't had to work very hard to learn it. "Hell of a thing to watch from up here," Wade said. Conversational. Neither of them answered. "I'm going to tell you something," Wade said, "and you can do what you want with it." He let his horse shift a step to the right, which was a natural movement, not a threatening one, but it changed the angle and made the firelight hit his face differently, made it easier for them to see him clearly. "The survey filing happened 2 days ago. County clerk's office has it. I have a receipt." He paused. "Whatever he told you this fire was going to accomplish, it's already not true. You understand what I'm saying to you?" The older one looked at the younger one, brief, not quick enough to be subtle. "The boundary's recorded," Wade continued. "The creek is ours by documented law. Burn every blade of grass on that ranch and it doesn't change the paper at the clerk's office. The only thing a fire does now is make destruction charges a real possibility for anyone who can be connected to where it started." He let that sit for a moment. "Which is a ridge on a specific night with 2 specific horses whose shoe prints are going to be easy enough to follow in the morning." The younger one looked at the older one. The older one looked at the fire. Then he reined his horse around and rode north along the ridge at a trot. The younger one followed, a half-second behind. They didn't run. Running would have been an admission, but they went, and they went consistently north toward the larger property that sat above the boundary line, and Wade watched them go until the darkness folded around them and he couldn't see them anymore. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the ridge at a dead run. He came back across the pasture faster than was strictly safe in the dark, and he could see immediately that things had changed in the 9 or 10 minutes he'd been gone. The fire had advanced another 50 yards at minimum. The heat was now distinct, a physical presence against the left side of his face as he rode south along the firebreak line, something you had to acknowledge rather than ignore. Clara was still plowing. She should not still have been plowing. He had told her if the fire got ahead of the line, she was to ride for the creek. The fire was not ahead of the line yet, not technically, not by 20 yards or so, but 20 yards at the speed it was moving was maybe 4 minutes, and the plow horse was nearly done. He could see that clearly now, the way the animal's head had dropped further and its stride had shortened, the deep labored heave of its breathing audible over the fire's sound. "Clara!" He came up alongside her, pulling his horse close. "You need to stop." "Not done," she said through her teeth. Her face was sheened with effort, her hair completely loose now, her gloves torn through at the right palm. "The plow horse is spent." "I know." "Oh, we're not going to finish the line." "I know that too." She didn't look at him. She was looking at the ground in front of the blade, guiding the rig through a stretch where the soil had a shelf of harder clay beneath it that was fighting every inch. "But there's a low spot ahead, maybe 40 feet. If I can get through this hard section and reach it." He looked ahead of her. He couldn't see the depression from horseback in this light, but she'd been walking this line for 40 minutes, and she could feel the ground changing under her boots. And he had learned something in the past 3 weeks about Clara Whitmore's specific kind of knowing, which was the kind that came from sustained physical attention rather than theory. He dismounted. It took about 1 second to decide it. He looped his horse's reins around the plow handle to keep the animal moving forward. It was a barely functional solution, but it added the second horse's weight to the plow's forward motion. And he grabbed a shovel from where it had been tied to the plow frame and moved ahead of the rig. The idea was rough, and it wouldn't win any prizes for elegance. If he could break the surface ahead of the blade with the shovel, loosening the harder clay shelf before the plow reached it, it would reduce the resistance enough to let the exhausted plow horse keep moving. It was twice the work spread between 2 people instead of organized work, and it was awkward and inefficient, and the fire was close enough now that he could feel it on the back of his neck when the wind gusted. He worked. Clara worked behind him. The plow horse worked because there was no alternative offered to it. The fire reached the beginning of the fire break line. It hit the bare earth and spread along it in both directions, looking for the fuel it expected to find, and where the earth was already turned, it found nothing and faltered. But the line wasn't complete. There was a gap, a break in the bare earth, maybe 15 feet, at the section where the clay had resisted the longest. And the fire found it. It jumped. Wade saw it happen from 20 feet ahead, a low sheet of flame that crossed the gap in the fire break and landed in the dry grass on the south side. And for a moment he felt his chest drop all the way to his boots, the particular sensation of watching the thing you've been working against happen despite everything. Clara didn't stop. He heard the plow grinding forward behind him, heard the horse's labored breathing, heard Clara make a sound that was not quite a word and not quite anything else. And he turned back to the shovel work without discussing it because there was nothing to discuss. The jumped section was burning southward now, a secondary fire that hadn't yet built momentum. If they could complete the main fire break line before the secondary fire widened, the main line would still stop the primary advance. The secondary fire they could fight with shovels and the wet burlap sacks Clara had brought and the proximity of the creek. 20 more feet of line. 15. The secondary fire was 20 yards to his right and building, fed by the same north wind that had fed everything tonight. 10 feet. The clay shelf ended. The soil changed. He could feel it in the shovel, the resistance dropping, the blade going in clean and easy. And Clara felt it too because the plow surged forward almost involuntarily, the tired horse finding something extra in the easier going, the way exhausted animals sometimes did in the final stretch. 5 feet. The low depression. He could see it now. A shallow swale running east, the grass lower and thinner, a natural break that had been there all along waiting for someone to connect it to. Clara drove the plow through the last stretch with everything the horse had left. The blade broke through to the swale. The line was complete. The primary fire reached the bare earth. It spread along the fire break, searching for passage in both directions and found none. And it stalled. Not immediately, not cleanly, because fires don't do anything cleanly. But it slowed and backed and ate itself in the margin of exposed soil, and the height of the flame dropped from 8 feet to 4 feet to 2 feet as the wind pushed it into the barrier it couldn't cross. Wade turned to the secondary fire with the shovel, and Clara came with the burlap sacks, and they beat it. In the literal sense, the actual physical beating of small flames with wet fabric, the kind of firefighting that leaves burns on your hands and forearms from proximity and fills your lungs with smoke and ruins your eyes for the next hour with the combination of heat and particulate and effort. It took 23 minutes, not clean, not organized. The secondary fire jumped twice more, each time smaller, and each jump was beaten back, and the perimeter of burned ground grew in fits and starts, and then stopped growing as the fuel in the gap section was consumed and the fire ran out of material. When it was done, Wade stood in the middle of a burned section that smelled of char and scorched earth and looked like a wound in the grass. And he looked at the firebreak line, and he looked at the barn and the house beyond it, untouched. And he looked at Clara. She was standing 8 feet from him. Her face was streaked with ash and sweat, and her dress was going to be a total loss, and there was a burn on her left forearm about 3 inches long that she was going to need to look at in better light. And she was looking back at him with the kind of expression a person has when they've used everything they had and have come out the other side of it and don't yet know how to be a person who is not in the middle of a crisis. He crossed the 8 feet between them. He didn't do it consciously, not exactly. His body simply moved the way bodies move when the thing they were afraid of not reaching is suddenly reachable. He put his hand against her face, the unburned side, his palm against her cheek, and she closed her eyes for just a moment, one moment, the way you close your eyes when something you've been braced against stops pressing. "Your arm," he said. "I know," she said. "We need to look at it." "I know." She opened her eyes. She didn't step back from his hand. "The cattle?" "Creek pasture. All 73. Something moved through her face. Not relief exactly. Relief was too small a word for it. It was the specific emotion that comes when the thing you've been fighting for is confirmed to still exist. "The barn?" "Standing." "The house?" "Standing." She nodded once, slowly. The nod of someone absorbing a sum of information that requires a moment to settle. Then she took a long, unsteady breath and said, "I could not have done this alone." It was not the kind of thing Clara said easily. He understood that about her without having to be told. It was the statement of a woman who had spent 15 months doing everything alone and knew the precise weight of what alone meant. "You didn't do it alone," he said. His hand was still on her face, and neither of them moved to change that. The burned grass smelled of smoke, and the surviving grass beyond the fire break smelled of cold night air, and the fire was down to scattered embers along the break line, cooling as the wind dropped slightly toward morning, and the cattle were safe in the creek pasture, and the house and the barn were standing, and the survey was filed and recorded and permanent. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Mercer, who had married a stranger 6 weeks ago out of necessity and intelligence, and a particular kind of courage that didn't announce itself, stood in the middle of a blackened field with ash on her face and a burn on her arm. And she did not look like a woman who had been defeated. She looked like a woman who had been tested and had declined to break. Wade lowered his hand eventually, not because the moment asked him to end it, but because there was still work to do. The plow horse needed water, the cattle needed checking, the secondary fire perimeter needed watching until full daylight, and Clara's arm needed tending before the burn set. "Come on," he said, and they walked back toward the house together across the scorched and unscorched ground, through the smell of smoke and cold November air, through the last of the dark before the sky began its slow turn toward gray. Behind them, the embers along the fire break continued to cool. Ahead of them, the house light was still burning in the kitchen window, the way Clara had left it when they ran out into the night, steady and small and entirely indifferent to what the past 3 hours had demanded, just doing the simple thing it had been asked to do. It was still doing it when they walked through the door. Wade found the medicine tin in the cabinet above the stove without having to be told where it was, which meant he'd been paying attention to more than fence lines and ledger books in 6 weeks of living in this house. And he sat Clara down at the kitchen table and looked at the burn in the proper light. It was a 2nd-degree burn, maybe 2.5 inches. Not dangerous, but going to be painful for several days and needing to be kept clean. He dressed it with what was in the tin. There wasn't much, but there was enough, and wrapped it carefully while Clara sat without flinching and looked at the tabletop with the focused inward expression of someone taking stock of everything that had just happened. When he was done, she looked at the wrapping on her arm for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Those men on the ridge," she said. "You went up there." Yes. What did you say to them? He told her. The survey, the receipt, the lack of purpose in burning a ranch when the boundary was already legally recorded. She listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. You think they went back to Crowder, she said. I think they had to, Wade said. They needed to tell him the filing was done. That changes what he can do next. Does it change what he'll try? Wade considered that honestly. Probably. Whether it changes it enough, that's the part I don't know yet. Clara nodded. She looked at her wrapped arm again, and then at the kitchen table, and then out the window at the sky, which was starting to go gray at the eastern edge, in the way that meant morning was coming, whether you were ready for it or not. The west pasture is going to need regrassing in the spring, she said, and I need to look at the plow horse's hooves. I was working through some heat-cracked ground in the dark, and I was too focused on the line to check his feet properly. Wade looked at her for a moment. We just put out a fire someone set on purpose to burn us out, he said. And your first thought this morning is the plow horse's hooves. His hooves are a problem I can actually fix before breakfast, Clara said. She looked at him steadily. The other things are problems for later in the day. He understood that. He lived by the same principle himself, had lived by it for 15 years. You dealt with the thing in front of you and deferred the things that weren't yet in reach. He just never articulated it quite that plainly. Go look at the horse, he said. I'll make coffee. She stood and moved toward the door, and then she stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. Wade, she said. He looked up from the stove. Thank you, she said. Not as a business partner. A pause. As something that doesn't have a name yet. She went out. He stood at the stove and listened to her footsteps cross the porch, and he put the kettle on, and for a while he just stood there in the kitchen with the morning coming gray through the east window and the smell of smoke still in his clothes and the sound of her footsteps in the yard fading toward the barn. Something that doesn't have a name yet. He thought he knew what she meant. He thought he'd known for several weeks, actually, and had been keeping the knowing at a careful distance because there was a difference between a practical arrangement and a real thing. And the real thing was considerably more frightening than the arrangement had ever been, because the arrangement had an exit clause, and the real thing didn't come with one. The kettle began to heat. Outside, the sky went from gray to pale gold, the first honest color since the fire had put its false orange on the horizon, and whatever was left of the night folded up and went somewhere else, the way nights do when they've used up everything they intended to use. The coffee was ready by the time Clara came back from the barn. She sat down. They drank it in silence, the good kind, the kind that didn't require filling, and outside the pale gold strengthened into genuine morning, and the ranch, their ranch, the legal and practical and increasingly real ranch of Wade and Clara Mercer, was still standing in it, all of it, every fence post, every board, every head of cattle safe in the creek pasture, all of it still theirs. The morning after the fire, Copper Hollow knew. That was the nature of small settlements in that era and that territory. News didn't travel through newspapers or telegraph lines so much as it traveled through the particular human current that runs between people who live close enough to one another that what happens to one person feels like something that happened near everyone. By mid-morning, 3 separate riders had passed the Mercer property on the main road and slowed at the gate to look at the blackened western pasture. And by noon, the general store owner's wife had sent her daughter out with a basket of bread and preserves, which was the frontier way of saying, "We heard, and we wanted you to know we heard." Clara accepted the basket at the door and said thank you and went back to work. She was not a woman who knew how to receive concern gracefully. Wade had noticed that. She accepted practical help, an extra pair of hands, a tool borrowed, a question answered. But the softer variety of attention made her uncomfortable in the way that people are uncomfortable when they've built their entire operating identity around not needing anything, and someone offers them something anyway. Wade understood it. He was the same way, more or less. The difference was that Clara had a community she'd been part of for years, which meant the community had opinions about her situation that she had to navigate. And Wade was new enough that most of those opinions were still forming. He found out exactly how they were forming 3 days after the fire, when he rode into Copper Hollow for lumber and fence wire and found himself the subject of more direct attention than he'd received since arriving in Kansas. It started at the feed store. The owner, a heavy-set man named Dillard, who had the careful neutrality of someone who sold supplies to every operation in the county and therefore couldn't afford to take sides in any dispute, watched Wade load wire onto the wagon with the particular quality of attention that meant he wanted to say something and was deciding whether to say it. Wade let him decide. "Hell of a thing," Dillard said finally. "That fire." "Yes," Wade agreed. "Western pasture?" "Mostly. We got a brake line down in time to save the barn and the house." He lifted another spool of wire. "Cattle are fine." Dillard was quiet for a moment. "People were saying Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Mercer, I suppose. People were saying she'd lose the place before winter." Paused. "They weren't being unkind. They just didn't see how she could hold it." "She held it," Wade said. "She had help." "She did," Wade said, and he said it in a way that wasn't falsely modest and wasn't self-promoting either, just factual, the way the situation actually was. "And she did things during that fire I couldn't have done. So it goes both ways." Dillard looked at him for a moment with the considering expression of a man revising an estimate he'd formed without enough information. "You fixing the western fence yourself?" "Starting today." "You need another pair of hands. My boy's free on Thursday." It was an offer made the way real offers are made in places where people know the difference between charity and community. Not loudly, not with any performance of generosity, just laid out plainly and available to be accepted or not. "I'll take him up on that," Wade said. "Tell him 8 o'clock." He loaded the last of the lumber and drove the wagon home, and he didn't think too much about the conversation, except to note that Copper Hollow was doing what small places did after a crisis. It was deciding what it thought and what it thought was going to matter for a long time. The fence work took a week. Wade had said the western fence needed to be rebuilt stronger than before, and he meant it not as a figure of speech, but as an engineering decision. The old posts had been set too shallow for the soil type, which was why 3 of them had already worked loose before the fire, and why the fire itself had taken the whole western line without much resistance. He dug new post holes 18 inches deeper than the originals, used heavier timber, and ran 3 strands of wire instead of 2. Dillard's son came on Thursday as promised, a quiet boy of about 19 named Eli, who worked hard and didn't talk much, which made him genuinely useful rather than just present. By the end of the day, he and Wade had set 14 posts and strung wire across the most exposed section of the western line, and Wade paid him fairly and told him the work was good, both of which were true. Clara brought them coffee mid-afternoon. She handed Eli his cup without ceremony and looked at the fence line they'd built, and she said, "That's better than the original." And she said it to both of them, which Eli seemed to appreciate in the particular way that young people appreciate being included in a professional assessment rather than simply thanked for their labor. "Your husband knows fence," Eli told her, with the guileless directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to make compliments complicated. Clara looked at Wade over her coffee cup. "I'm finding that out," she said. After Eli left that evening, Clara stood at the kitchen window while Wade washed up at the pump outside, and she watched him the way she'd been watching him with increasing frequency over the past weeks. Not obviously, not in a way she'd have wanted to be caught at, but with the sustained attention of someone who is trying to understand something that keeps refusing to be simple. She had made a practical arrangement. The practical arrangement had become something she didn't have a category for. That was the problem. The burn on her arm was healing, itching now, which was a good sign medically and an aggravating one personally, and she'd caught herself reaching to scratch it twice in situations where scratching would have been undignified. The ranch was functioning better than it had at any point since Thomas died. The bank payments were current, the western fence was stronger than it had ever been. And the man doing most of this was the same man who had appeared at her gate with 4 days of road dust on him and no guarantee of anything, and had said yes before sunrise to a proposition that most reasonable people would have ridden away from. She had chosen him for practical reasons. She was increasingly aware that the choosing had become something else, and that the something else was not going to be manageable from behind a practical framework forever. She turned from the window before he came back inside and started on supper, because supper was a concrete problem, and concrete problems were what she knew how to handle. Silas Crowder came to the property on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the fire. He came alone this time, no riders behind him, no performance of authority. He rode up to the western fence, the new western fence, the one Wade had rebuilt post by post, and he sat there until Wade walked out from the barn where he'd been repairing a stall gate. Wade stopped about 10 feet from the fence and looked at him. Crowder looked older than he had at their last meeting. Not dramatically so, not aged overnight the way people described in stories. But there was something around his eyes that hadn't been there before. A particular quality of a man who has run a calculation several times and kept getting an answer he doesn't like. "You can't prove anything about the fire," Crowder said. He said it as an opening, which told Wade it had been sitting in him for 3 weeks pressing to get out. "No," Wade agreed. "I can't." A pause. Crowder seemed slightly wrong-footed by the agreement. "Then what happens now?" Crowder said, and it was somewhere between a question and a statement, the syntax of a man who was used to controlling the terms of conversations and was finding this one resistant to that. Wade put one boot on the lower fence rail. His fence rail, his post, his wire, rebuilt after the fire, and looked at Crowder with the kind of steadiness that comes not from aggression, but from having absolutely nothing to prove to the person you're looking at. "You already know what happens now," Wade said. "The survey is filed. The creek is ours by recorded law. The bank is refinanced. The cattle came through the fire in good shape." He paused. "And Clara is no longer a woman alone on 260 acres who can be waited out." Crowder's jaw moved slightly, not speaking, just the movement of a man absorbing something he'd already known was coming. "I spent 3 years on that boundary question," Crowder said. "I know you did," Wade said. "And I understand why. That creek is worth a great deal to the ranches downstream, and you knew it, and you waited for the right situation to use it." He wasn't saying it with contempt. He was saying it the way you name a thing accurately. "The situation you were waiting for didn't develop the way you planned." Crowder looked at him for a long moment. "Your wife's a harder woman than Thomas was," he said finally. "She's a more determined one," Wade said. "Thomas was a good man, but Clara built half of what's on this property with her own hands, and she knows it better than anyone alive. You underestimated what that meant." "And you?" Crowder said. "What did I underestimate about you?" Wade considered that honestly. "Probably that I didn't have anything to lose when I got here. A man with nothing to lose and something worth fighting for is a difficult combination." Crowder was quiet for a while. The wind moved through the new fence wire and made a faint sound that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite noise. "I'm going to withdraw my interest in the property," Crowder said. It cost him to say it, not in a dramatic way, but in the way that any genuine concession costs a man who has spent years building a position. "The boundary stands as filed. I won't challenge it." "I appreciate you saying that directly," Wade said. "I'm not saying it as a kindness," Crowder said flatly. "I'm saying it because I'm 61 years old, and I've got 3 other properties and a cattle operation of my own to manage. And spending my remaining years fighting a recorded survey and a man who rebuilds fence posts in frozen ground is not how I intend to do it." Wade almost smiled. Almost. "That's a reasonable position." Crowder looked at the fence line one more time, and then he looked at Wade, and there was something in the look that was not friendly and not hostile, and was in some ways more honest than either of those things. It was the look of one practical man acknowledging another practical man across a line that neither of them was going to cross again. Then he turned his horse and rode north, and he did not look back. Wade stood at the fence until Crowder had gone out of sight, and then he stood there a little longer, his boot on the rail, the wind in the wire, and he felt the thing settle, not with triumph, which would have been the wrong feeling for it, but with the particular quiet of a problem that has been genuinely resolved rather than deferred. He turned and walked back to the barn to finish the stall gate. Clara found the ledger entry by accident. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been going through the accounts to update the November numbers. The bank payment had gone out, the cattle count was current, the hay supply needed to be projected through February. And she'd opened the cash book to the wages page and started reading from the top, the way you do when you want context for a current number, and she got to October and stopped. Wade's wages line was blank. She went back to September. Blank. August. The month he'd arrived, the month they'd married. A partial entry, the first 2 weeks of wages recorded, and then nothing. She sat very still at the desk for a moment. Then she went back through the supply receipts she kept in the tin box, the ones for the past 3 months of operations, and she started adding. The fencing materials for the original west fence repair, paid. The independent surveyor, Arthur Gell, paid. The winter hay surplus Wade had insisted on purchasing in October when the price was lower, paid. The second batch of fence posts and wire for the rebuilt western line, Paid. The medicine supplies she'd asked him to pick up in town in early November. Paid. The new stall gate hardware from last week. Paid. All of it paid, all of it coming out of the operating account. And the operating account was in better shape than it had been in 2 years, which she had attributed to the refinancing terms and the efficiency improvements Wade had made in the first months. She hadn't looked closely at where the money was actually coming from. She looked now. The wages line told her. 3.5 months of wages sitting uncollected in the ledger, while the man who'd earned them spent the money on fence posts and hay and survey fees and medicine for the household he was technically being paid to help run. Clara sat at the desk for a long time. She was not a woman who cried easily or often. She had learned in the 15 months of Thomas's death and its aftermath that crying was a thing the body demanded occasionally, but that it had limited practical utility, and she'd developed a fairly efficient relationship with it in which she allowed it briefly when it was necessary and then set it aside and got back to the work. This was not one of the crying occasions. This was something else, a feeling that sat in the chest without quite resolving into any single emotion, compounded of several things at once: gratitude and something sharper than gratitude, and a particular kind of understanding that arrives when you realize a person has been doing something significant without asking to be noticed for it. She heard his boots on the porch at dusk. She closed the cash book and put it back on the shelf and was standing at the stove when he came through the door, and she kept her back to him for a moment while she collected the expression she wanted to have for this conversation. "Supper's another 20 minutes, she said. "That's fine." She heard him hang his hat, the sound of him washing his hands at the basin, the ordinary sounds of a person settling into a house at the end of a day. She turned around. "I went through the cash book today," she said. He looked up from drying his hands. His face was the face of a man who has known for some time that a particular conversation was coming and has decided not to try to prevent it. "I was going to bring it up," he said. "When?" A pause. "When it seemed like the right time." 3.5 months, Wade. I know. That's real money. She kept her voice even, which required some effort. "That's money I agreed to pay you. That's part of the arrangement we made." "The ranch needed it more than I did," he said. And the way he said it was the problem. Not defensive, not performing nobility, just stating a fact the way he stated any fact, in the plain direct manner of a man who didn't know how to dress things up, even when dressing them up might have been easier. "You don't get to decide that," Clara said. "That was my decision to make." "You're right," he said immediately. "You're right. I should have talked to you about it." She hadn't expected him to concede that quickly, and it knocked the edge off what she'd intended to say next. "Why didn't you?" she asked, and the question came out with less force than she'd planned for and more honesty. Wade set the towel down on the basin edge and looked at her from across the kitchen. In the lamplight, his face was the same face she'd been watching for 3.5 months, the face she'd made a decision about at a feed store notice board and had been finding out the specifics of ever since. "Because if I'd asked," he said, "you'd have said no. And the fence needed doing, and the hay needed buying, and the surveyor needed paying, and—" He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment. "I didn't come here for wages. That's not why I stayed." The kitchen was quiet. "Then why did you stay?" she asked. He looked up. "You know why." "I want to hear you say it." Another pause. The kind that wasn't hesitation, but was a man choosing the right words rather than the available ones, which was a distinction she'd learned to recognize about him. "Every place I ever worked," he said, "I was solving someone else's problem. And that was fine. I was good at it. I'd ride in and fix what was broken and move on, and the next outfit would have different problems, and I'd fix those too." He came to the table and sat down, not to make the conversation smaller, but because it was a conversation that needed to be sat down for. "I got here, and I looked at the ledgers, and I looked at the fence, and I walked the creek, and I thought, this is a good piece of land being run by a woman who knows exactly what she's doing and just needs the weight distributed differently." He looked at her directly. "And then I realized I wasn't thinking about how to fix it and leave. I was thinking about how to fix it and stay." Clara sat down across from him. "The arrangement we made doesn't require that," she said. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't. The practical purpose has been served, the loan is refinanced, the boundary is established, Crowder's withdrawn, the ranch is functional." "Yes." You could leave tomorrow with your wages and your 10% and have no obligation to anyone. I know that, he said. So, he looked at her for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the November dark had come down fully, and the stars were beginning in the way they did out here. Not a few at a time, but suddenly, all at once, the sky committing tonight without a lot of discussion about it. So I don't want to, he said. That's the whole answer. I don't want to. Clara looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the morning after the fire, when he'd put his palm against her face in the blackened field, and she'd closed her eyes for one moment because the weight of 15 months had been briefly held by something outside herself. She thought about coffee at 4 in the morning after a crisis. She thought about 3.5 months of uncollected wages going back into fence posts and hay. She thought about what she'd said to him that morning, something that doesn't have a name yet. I've been thinking about what I said after the fire, she said. So have I. The name for it. She stopped, considered. I think I was wrong to say it didn't have one. I think I knew what it was and I wasn't ready to say it clearly. Wade was very still across the table. I'm not good at this, Clara said. Thomas and I, we were practical people. We were fond of each other. We built something together and we worked well, and I missed him and I grieved him genuinely. But this is, she looked up, this is different from what I've known before. And the difference frightens me a little. Not because it's bad, because it matters. He reached across the table. Not dramatically, just put his hand on the table between them, available. She put hers on top of it. I'm going to say something, he said, and I need you to understand I'm not saying it to fulfill an expectation or because the situation asks for it. All right, she said. I love you. He said it the way he said everything, plain, direct, no decoration. I think I have for a while now, and I don't have a lot of experience with that, so I can't promise I'll do it perfectly, but I'm not leaving. I'm not interested in leaving. This ranch and you, that's what I want, and I've never before been able to say that about any place or any person. Clara sat with that. She sat with it the way she sat with important things, thoroughly, giving it the attention it deserved rather than rushing to respond. I love you too, she said. I'm still figuring out what to do with that, because it wasn't what I arranged for and I don't have a plan for it. But it's true. The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the wind moved through the new fence wire on the western line, the fence they'd rebuilt together from the ground up. They sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, her hand on his, neither of them feeling the need to fill the silence, because the silence was full enough. December came with its particular Kansas cold, the kind that didn't apologize or moderate, and the ranch absorbed it the way the ranch absorbed everything, by requiring more work, more attention, more daily effort, and rewarding that effort with the specific satisfaction of a thing maintained rather than surrendered. Wade finished the second well repair before the hard freeze, as he'd promised. It took 2 mornings of working in cold that made the metal burn to touch and left his hands stiff for most of each afternoon, but the casing rock was secure before the ground froze solid, which meant the well would come through winter without cracking. He wrote it off the list he carried in his head and moved to the next item on it. The cattle wintered better than the previous year. Clara had reorganized the grazing rotation in November, resting the burned western pasture entirely and rotating through the creek pasture and the southern sections in a pattern she'd worked out from Thomas's old records and from 3 months of conversation with Wade about what the land was telling them. The herd came through December in better condition than she'd seen since before Thomas died. She noted that in the cash book without ceremony. Some evenings they sat at the kitchen table after supper and went through the accounts together. Not because the accounts required 2 people, they didn't, but because it had become the kind of thing they did, the way couples develop rhythms that aren't strictly necessary but are the texture of shared life. Clara ran the numbers. Wade listened and asked questions that were sometimes simple and occasionally the kind of question that sent her back to recheck something she thought was settled. She didn't mind the rechecking. She minded less than she'd have expected herself to, which itself told her something. One evening in January, she looked up from the cash book and said, "We're going to make the February payment ahead of schedule." Wade looked up from the harness he was mending at the far end of the table. "How far ahead?" 8 days. He nodded slowly. "First time since Thomas died?" "First time since the year before he died." She looked at the number again. "It's because of the hay purchase in October. We didn't have to buy at winter prices." We had to spend the money in October instead of waiting. Yes. She looked at him across the table. Which was your idea. You agreed to it. After you explained it 3 times. Twice, he said. The third time you'd already agreed and I was just making sure you didn't change your mind. She almost laughed. It came out as a breath that was most of a laugh, and he saw it. And the corner of his mouth moved in that way it did when he was satisfied about something but wasn't going to perform satisfaction. I want to pay you your back wages in February, Clara said, when the payment clears. He looked back at the harness. That money's already... I know where it went. I tracked it. She kept her voice firm. You're a partner in this operation, and partners get paid. And the fact that you chose to invest your wages rather than draw them doesn't mean you're not owed them. It means you made a smart choice that benefited both of us. And I'm going to pay you for your time, and you're going to accept it. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. That wasn't difficult, she said, slightly surprised. You used your argument voice, he said. When you use your argument voice, I've learned it's faster to agree and work out the details after. She looked at him. He was focused on the harness. There was a faint crease at the corner of his eye that she'd learned was how he looked when he was keeping something back. Not hiding it, just containing it, the way he contained most things that might otherwise get loose. I don't have an argument voice, she said. You have 2, he said. There's the flat practical one, and there's the one where the words come slower and more deliberate, like you've already thought the whole thing through and you're giving me the conclusion rather than the reasoning. That second one is the argument voice. Clara sat with that for a moment. How long have you been studying me? She said. He finally looked up. Since the morning you asked if I could read a ledger before you told me your name. There was nothing to say to that would have been adequate, so she didn't say anything, and he went back to the harness, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the January wind ran along the western fence, the rebuilt fence, 18 inches deeper than the original, stronger than it had ever been. And the sound it made in the wire was just wind and wire, nothing meaningful, and also somehow everything. February brought a thaw that lasted 4 days, and then a freeze harder than anything they'd had in December, and the stock tank iced over solid enough that Wade had to break it twice daily with the heavy maul, a job that left his shoulders aching in a way that was honestly annoying rather than dramatically painful. The kind of ache that comes with necessary work, and doesn't earn any sympathy because everyone who sees it understands it, was simply what needed doing. He broke the ice at 6 in the morning and at 4 in the afternoon, and he did not complain about it, which Clara noticed, because Thomas had complained about the ice breaking in the way that people complain about things they want acknowledged without actually wanting fixed. Wade just did it and came in and washed his hands and asked if there was coffee. She started having coffee ready at 4:15. He never commented on that either, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The bank payment went out ahead of schedule on February 9th. Clara walked it to the post office herself, put it in the postal agent's hand personally rather than leaving it in the box, and stood on the Copper Hollow Main Street in the thin winter sunlight for a moment after, looking at the street she'd walked down dozens of times in the past 15 months, with the particular weight of a woman who isn't sure her situation is going to survive another season. She didn't have that weight this morning. She noticed its absence specifically, the way you notice when a sound you've been hearing for so long it's become background finally stops. She walked to the dry goods store and bought thread and a new pair of work gloves and a peppermint stick, the last of which she hadn't bought herself in longer than she could recall. And she rode back to the ranch in the cold mid-morning light, with the particular feeling of a person who has been in a fight that seemed likely to go badly and has discovered, not with fanfare, but with quiet, steadying certainty, that they are going to be all right. Wade was at the rebuilt west fence when she came through the gate, doing what he was apparently always doing when she returned from anywhere, some piece of necessary maintenance that was going to matter more in March than it did in February, but that he was doing now because February was when he had the time. She stopped the wagon near the fence line. "Payment's out," she said. He looked up from the post he was examining for stress fractures. "Good." Prescott's clerk looked surprised when I handed it to him. "He'll get used to it," Wade said. She looked at him kneeling at the fence post, his good hat pulled low against the wind, his coat the one he'd arrived in 4 months ago that was starting to show the work of the intervening months in its elbows and cuffs. She thought about what she'd known about him at the gate that first day, almost nothing, and what she knew about him now, which was a considerable amount, most of it learned from watching how he spent his time when no one was asking him to account for it. "When the pasture comes back in spring," she said, "I want to talk about expanding the herd. There's a rancher south of Hayes who's been selling off breeding stock at reasonable prices. I think we could absorb 12 to 15 head if we manage the grazing rotation the way we have been." Wade looked up at her with the expression she'd learned to read as genuine engagement with a problem. Not just courtesy, not just agreement, but actual thinking. "Creek pasture would need a rest month between the new acquisitions," he said. "I know, I was thinking May." "May's late for a rest month." "June, then." "June works," he said. She nodded and drove the wagon on toward the barn, and behind her she heard him go back to the fence post, tapping it with his knuckles, listening to what the wood told him about its own soundness, the way he listened to everything, patiently, without expectation, giving the thing in front of him the full weight of his attention. She put the wagon away and went to make supper. Outside, the wind moved through the western fence. The fence held. It was going to keep holding. Spring came to Copper Hollow the way it always came to that part of Kansas. Not gently, not with any particular grace, but with the blunt insistence of a season that had been waiting long enough and was done waiting. The freeze broke in early March. The ground softened in fits and starts over 2 weeks. And then one morning, Wade walked out to check the western pasture and found the first green pushing through the burned earth, thin and uncertain, but unmistakably alive. The particular sharp green of new growth coming up through char that has sat all winter collecting whatever nutrients the fire left behind. He stood there for a while looking at it. He wasn't a sentimental man, or hadn't thought of himself as one for most of his adult life. Sentimentality required a certain investment in places and things that he hadn't been able to afford when every place was temporary. But he stood in the early March cold with his boots in the softening earth of the burned pasture and looked at the new green coming up through the black. And he felt something that wasn't quite sentiment and wasn't quite pride and was probably some combination of the two that doesn't have a clean name in English. He'd helped make this possible. Not alone. That was the important part, the part that was different from every other place he'd ever worked. He hadn't ridden in and fixed someone else's problem and ridden out again. He'd fixed a problem that was partly his, on land that was partly his, beside a woman who was entirely his own, and the green coming up through the burned ground was coming up for both of them. He went back inside and told Clara the western pasture was starting to recover. She was at the desk with the cash book, which was where she was most mornings before the day's work pulled her away from it, and she looked up with the quick, focused attention she gave to news about the land. "How much coverage?" she asked. "Maybe a third of the burned section. It'll spread. The soil's good under the char. Probably better than it was before." He poured coffee. "We should check the creek pasture fence this week. The ground movement over winter might have shifted some of the posts." "I'll do it Thursday," she said. "You've got the stock to move to the south section." "Friday works for the stock. Thursday's better for the fence while the ground's still soft enough to reset posts without breaking your back." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "You know I was going to suggest the same thing." "I know," she said, and went back to the cash book. That was how most mornings went now. Not romantic in the way stories described romance. Not full of significant glances and meaningful pauses. It was more functional than that, which was its own kind of intimacy. They had learned to occupy the same days efficiently, which sounds like a small thing until you have spent years living in other people's spaces and eating at other people's tables, and understanding that efficiency requires a level of mutual knowledge that can't be performed or rushed. Wade had never had that with anyone. He hadn't known what he was missing, which was perhaps the only mercy in 15 years of moving. The agreement happened on a Tuesday evening in late March, and it happened without planning, which was appropriate because the things that mattered most between them had never followed a plan. Clara had spent the afternoon in the south pasture checking fence, which had indeed needed 3 post resets, and Wade had moved 32 head of cattle to the spring grazing section and repaired the water line to the stock tank, which had developed a slow seep over winter that was going to become a fast seep by summer if it wasn't addressed. By the time they both came in at dusk, they were the kind of tired that has specific textures, not the exhausted collapse of crisis, but the deep-settled fatigue of a full day's honest work, the kind that sits in the muscles rather than the nerves, and is, when you're honest about it, not unpleasant. Clara made supper. After supper, she went to the desk and came back to the kitchen table carrying something Wade recognized. The original marriage agreement, the document they'd signed in the presence of the justice of the peace, and two witnesses on a cold November morning that felt simultaneously like very recently and a different era entirely. She set it on the table between them. He looked at it. "I've been thinking about this for a while," she said. She didn't sit down immediately. She stood with her hands resting on the back of her chair, looking at the document, and he could see her working through something internally, not hesitating, exactly, but organizing, the way she organized the cash book before she started writing in it. "The practical purpose is served," she said. "The loan is refinanced. The boundary is recorded. We've made 2 payments ahead of schedule. The ranch is stable." She looked up at him. "Everything this document was designed to accomplish has been accomplished." Wade looked at the agreement on the table. "Clara," he said, "let me finish." She sat down. "When I wrote these terms, I was trying to solve a specific set of problems. Bank, boundary, Crowder. I needed a legal partner, and I needed someone competent, and I needed it done quickly before I lost everything Thomas and I built." She looked at the document. "What I didn't account for was the person. I was thinking about the arrangement, and I forgot that arrangements involve people, and people are not arrangements." Wade was quiet. "This document gives you an exit," she said. 10% ownership, back wages, the right to leave on reasonable terms. I wrote those terms to make the agreement fair to you, because I was asking a stranger to take a significant risk, and I wanted him to be protected if it didn't work." She finally looked directly at him. "I don't want you to have an exit anymore. Not because I'm trying to trap you, but because I want you to be here because you're choosing to be here, not because you signed a paper 7 months ago." She reached across the table and picked up the document, and she tore it in half. Not dramatically, not slowly for effect, just deliberately, the clean, decisive tear of a woman who has made up her mind and sees no reason to draw the moment out. She set both halves on the table. "I'm not your employer," she said. "I'm not your business partner, or I am those things, but I'm more than those things. And this document was only about those things. And I need what's between us to be bigger than a document." Wade looked at the two halves of the agreement on the table. He thought about the morning he'd arrived at her gate, the 4 days of riding, the barn wall he'd slept against, the questions she'd asked before she knew his name. He thought about all of it, 7 months compressed into the single image of a torn document on a kitchen table. "I wasn't staying because of the document," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I tore it." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "I want to stay," he said. "Not for the 10%, not for the wages, not because I signed something." "Why then?" "Because this is the first place I've ever been where I understood why someone would want to stay." He looked at her, not past her, not at the window or the wall, but directly at her, which was still something he had to choose to do rather than something that happened automatically, because directness of that particular kind required an ongoing act of will from a man who had spent 32 years developing excellent skills at looking at everything except what mattered. "And because you're the reason it's that place." Clara didn't look away. "That's the clearest thing you've ever said to me," she said. "I've been working up to it." She almost laughed. The almost laugh that he had learned was the real one, not the polite acknowledgement she gave to things that were mildly amusing, but the involuntary thing that came when something caught her off guard in a way she genuinely appreciated. "We should probably have a real ceremony," she said, not because the legal one didn't count, but because the legal one was for Prescott and the county clerk, and I think we deserve one that's for us. "Justice Harmon is still in town," Wade said. "He is." "Same 2 witnesses?" "The store owner's wife would probably appreciate being asked again," Clara said. "She's been watching this situation with considerable interest since November." "I noticed. Everyone noticed." She looked at him steadily. "Saturday?" "Saturday," he said. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has made a decision and is satisfied with it and doesn't need to elaborate. She picked up both halves of the torn agreement, walked to the stove, opened the firebox, and put them in. They burned quickly. Wade watched them go. He thought about all the contracts he'd signed in his working life. Employment agreements, seasonal hire papers, the standard documents of a man who worked for others. And how none of them had meant anything lasting, how every one of them had been a temporary arrangement with a defined end, and how the one that had just burned had been written the same way and had become something else entirely, and how tearing it and burning it was the right ending for a document that had long since been replaced by something that didn't require paper to hold it together. The second ceremony was on a Saturday morning in late March, when the sky was doing what Kansas skies occasionally did in early spring, putting on an unlikely show of blue and high white clouds that made everything below it look clean and deliberate, as if the landscape was trying to make an impression. Justice Harmon was a small, elderly man who had married and buried half of Copper Hollow over the past 30 years and had developed the particular quality of efficient tenderness that long practice with significant moments produces. He used fewer words than the first ceremony, which was the right choice, because the first ceremony had needed formality and this one needed honesty. The store owner and his wife were the witnesses again. The wife, whose name was Margaret, and who had sent her daughter with bread and preserves the morning after the fire, stood next to her husband with an expression of considerable satisfaction, which she was not making any effort to conceal. There were 6 other people there, the Dillards, father and son, and 2 neighboring families who had been part of Copper Hollow long enough to understand what they were witnessing, which was not simply a wedding, but the resolution of a story the whole settlement had been following with the kind of invested attention that small communities give to the dramas of their members. Clara wore the same dark dress from the first ceremony. Wade had bought a new shirt in town on Thursday, which Clara had noticed and not commented on, and which represented the entire extent of his ceremonial preparation. Harmon said the words. Wade said his. Clara said hers, in the same clear, steady voice she used for everything that mattered, which was the voice of a woman who had decided to mean what she said and saw no reason to ornament meaning with performance. When it was done, Margaret embraced Clara with the force of someone who had been wanting to do that for 7 months and was finally getting the opportunity, and the store owner shook Wade's hand and said, "You did right by her," which was both simpler and more substantial than most of the things people say at these occasions. Eli Dillard, who was 19 and therefore still at the age where genuine feeling produces awkwardness, shook Wade's hand and said, "I'm glad you stayed, Mr. Mercer," and then looked mortified that he'd said it, and Wade told him it was all right and meant it. They didn't have a reception in any formal sense. Clara had made a cake, which had taken her 2 evenings of effort and had come out slightly lopsided on the right side, which she had pointed out to Wade before anyone arrived with the same dispassionate accuracy she applied to fence post angles. Wade had told her it tasted better than it needed to look. She had said that was either a compliment or an insult, and she hadn't decided which. He had said it was absolutely a compliment. The lopsided cake was, in its way, perfect. Not because imperfection is charming in the way that stories sometimes pretend it is, but because it was honest, which was more valuable than charm, and considerably more characteristic of both of them. People ate cake and talked and eventually went home, and by mid-afternoon Wade and Clara were alone in the yard in the thin spring sunlight, and Clara looked at the western pasture where the new green was spreading further each day through the burned section, and she said nothing for a while, and he stood beside her and also said nothing, and this was its own complete thing that didn't require words to finish it. Spring moved into a summer that was, for the first time in several years, a reasonable one. The rains came at intervals close enough to keep the grass from going brittle, far enough apart to let the land absorb what it received. The creek ran with more confidence than it had shown the previous fall, the spring-fed bend holding its depth through even the drier weeks, the boundary markers clearly showing its position inside their recorded line. The 14 head they'd purchased from the rancher south of Hayes in April turned out to be good stock, stronger than average, the breeding females particularly sound, and Clara's assessment of them on the day they arrived had been so precise and rapid that the rancher selling them had looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating an assumption he hadn't known he'd made. Wade had seen that expression on people's faces several times in the past months when they encountered Clara Whitmore operating in her full capacity, rather than in the capacity of the struggling widow. They'd had a year and a half to build a fixed opinion about. He appreciated it every time. The herd grew steadily. By midsummer, they were running 87 head, which was more than the ranch had carried since Thomas Whitmore's best years, and the grazing rotation they'd been refining since November was managing the pastures well enough that the grass was actually improving in sections rather than being held steady at marginal levels. Wade hired 2 temporary hands for the busiest stretch of summer work, a young man from south of town named Curtis, who worked hard and asked good questions, and an older hand named Beaumont, who had been in the territory since before Copper Hollow had a name, and who had the particular combination of vast knowledge and willingness to share it that is rarer in experienced men than it should be. Beaumont looked at their fence work in the first week and told Wade it was the best post setting he'd seen on a Kansas property, which Wade received with the same neutrality he received most assessments, but which he thought about more than once in the following days. Curtis was 21 and uncertain about most things except cattle, about which he was surprisingly sure. Wade started giving him more of the herd management work in August and watched how he handled it and said nothing for 2 weeks. And then one evening he told Curtis directly that he had good instincts with animals and should trust them more than he was trusting them. And Curtis looked at him with the startled expression of someone who hadn't expected directness and didn't know quite what to do with it yet but was going to value it later. Clara noticed. She watched how Wade worked with both men, not managing them exactly, not performing authority, but doing the thing that experienced people do with less experienced ones when they're paying attention, which is sharing the understanding rather than just the instruction. "You'd make a good teacher," she told him one evening. He looked at her over the ledger they were going through together, which had become the evening habit it had always been, but felt different now, comfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the numbers and everything to do with the table and the lamp and the person across from them. "I'm not patient enough for teaching," he said. "You're more patient than you think." She turned a page. "You explained the post-setting method to Eli Dillard 3 times in February, and you didn't raise your voice once. He was a good listener. You were a good explainer." She looked at him directly. "That's not an accident, Wade. You know how to show someone what you know without making them feel small for not already knowing it. That's rarer than fencing skill." He didn't have a ready answer for that, which was unusual for him, and Clara could see that she'd said something that landed in a place he didn't have a prepared response for, which she'd learned was the best indicator that something she'd said was genuinely true. He went back to the ledger, but she could see him thinking about it. The second bank payment of the year went out in August, again ahead of schedule, and this time Prescott himself sent a brief letter acknowledging receipt and noting that the account was in excellent standing. It was a formal letter, the kind that said nothing personal and meant something specific. It meant Prescott had revised his assessment, and while he was not going to say so plainly in writing, the formality of the letter was itself the acknowledgement that the Mercer Ranch was no longer a marginal account. He watched with concern, but a solid one. He filed without anxiety. Clara read the letter twice and put it in the tin box. She didn't say anything about it at supper that evening. Wade asked how the letter was. "Polite," she said. "That's new from Prescott." "It is," she agreed, and reached for the bread. He understood everything she wasn't saying, which was one of the things that made the silences between them comfortable rather than incomplete. In September, the drought came back. Not as brutal as the year before, nothing in that second year quite matched the particular sustained cruelty of the drought that had preceded Wade's arrival, but dry enough to tighten things, to lower the creek, to turn the grass cautious and sparse in the late summer sections. It was the creek that mattered most, and they both knew it, and they both knew that 2 ranches to the south were watching the Mercer Creek with the specific anxiety of people who depend on water they don't control. The Halverson Ranch, 2 miles south, ran its cattle through a section that connected to the creek's downstream flow. The smaller Denny operation, 3 miles beyond that, depended even more directly on the water that moved through before it reached them. Clara watched the creek levels for 2 weeks. Then she rode to both ranches. She came back from the Halverson Ranch first and sat at the kitchen table and told Wade what she'd found, which was cattle that were managing, but only barely, and a rancher who was too proud to say directly that he needed help and too worried to pretend entirely that he didn't. "He needs water access," she said. Wade was at the stove. He turned and looked at her. "Our creek." "Yes." He thought about that. Not about the legal question. The creek was theirs, recorded, established, permanent, but about the practical and human question, which was different and more complicated. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we open the east gate and let his cattle through to drink at the bend twice a week, on a schedule we agree on in advance." She looked at him steadily. "And the same for Denny." "That's a negotiation," he said. "It has terms." "Yes. And if they don't hold to the terms?" "Then we close the gate." She paused. "But I think they will. These aren't men who want to take something that isn't theirs. They're men in a difficult year who need a practical arrangement. Wade thought about practical arrangements. He thought about what practical arrangements could become when the people involved were honest about what they needed and what they were willing to do. "Do it," he said. Clara sent letters to both ranches that evening. Both replied within 4 days, and both accepted the terms she'd proposed, which were simple and fair and contained no fine print: twice weekly water access at the East Bend, scheduled on alternating days so neither ranch competed with the other, with the clear understanding that the Mercer boundary was the Mercer boundary, and the arrangement was a courtesy extended by choice and not a concession of any right. Halverson rode over personally when the first access day came, and he stood at the east gate while his cattle drank, and he looked at the depth of the pool in the spring-fed bend, and he turned to Wade, who had opened the gate and was leaning on the post watching the cattle settle, and he said, "I owe you." "You owe us a reasonable neighbor," Wade said. "That's all." Halverson looked at him for a moment. He was perhaps 60, a man who had built his ranch over decades with the kind of sustained effort that doesn't make the papers but builds something real. And he had the quality of someone who had seen enough of life to understand when something was being offered without strings. "Fair enough," he said. Denny was younger, maybe 40, and more visibly relieved, which made sense because his operation had less buffer, and the drought had pressed him closer to the edge. He brought a jar of his wife's preserved peaches when he came for the first water access, which was the rural tradition of expressing gratitude through something practical, and Clara accepted it with the directness she used for all genuine things. By late September, when the dry spell finally broke and the rains came back, the Halverson and Denny cattle were in better condition than they'd have been without the access, and both ranchers had spoken to 2 or 3 others about what the Mercer operation had done. And those conversations had their own downstream effects in the way of small communities where people remember who stood up when it mattered and who stood back. Copper Hollow had seen what the Mercer Ranch was. It was starting to understand what it was going to be. The porch was Wade's project through October. The house had a porch on the south side that had been adequate when Thomas built it and had been declining steadily since, and the east step had been broken since before Wade arrived and had never been properly repaired, only patched and repatched in the manner of things that get deferred indefinitely. Wade had been noting the porch's condition since his first day on the property and had been working toward addressing it for months, building materials when budget allowed, adding to the pile in the barn until he had enough to do it right. He started the week after the September rains. It took 12 days. He tore out the old decking entirely, replaced 2 of the support posts that had developed rot at the base, relaid the decking with better seasoned lumber set at a slight angle to drain water properly rather than hold it, rebuilt the railing, and replaced the broken east step and its 2 neighbors with new treads mortised into the stringer properly, rather than simply nailed on top. Clara watched the progress without comment for the first week, which was her way with things Wade was building. She let the work speak for itself rather than evaluating it in progress, which he appreciated. On the 9th day, when the decking was finished and he was working on the railing, she came out with coffee and sat on the new decking and ran her hand across the boards and said, "This is better than the original." "The original wasn't set up to drain," he said. "Every rain just sat on it. Thomas kept meaning to fix that. It's a job you put off until you have time for it." She was quiet for a moment. "He would have liked you," she said. Not sentimentally. Practically the way she said things she'd decided were true. He valued people who did the work right. Wade kept his eyes on the railing he was fitting. "That's a good thing to be valued for. He'd have wanted to know why you set the post that way. Better load distribution." "That's what he'd have said too." She looked at the decking again. He was always more interested in the why than the what. Most good builders are. She finished her coffee and went back inside, and Wade worked on the railing until the light went, and he thought about what she'd said, not with any complicated feeling about it, but with the simple recognition that Clara Whitmore carried Thomas Whitmore's memory the way people carry the real ones, which is not in a locked room, but in the ordinary current of daily thought, where it belongs. He didn't feel diminished by that. He felt, if anything, that it told him something important about the kind of woman Clara was, that she didn't revise history to make room for the present, didn't minimize what had been in order to justify what was now. Thomas had been real. What she and Wade had built was real. Both things were true simultaneously, and she refused to make them compete. That was the kind of person worth staying for. He drove the last nail on the porch railing on the 12th day, in the middle of a cold October afternoon that was threatening rain from the northwest. And he stepped back and looked at what he'd built, and then looked at the house behind it, and he had the specific sensation of a man who has finished a thing that was worth finishing, standing on ground that is worth standing on. He didn't call Clara out to see it. She came out on her own, at dusk, when she was done with the evening chores, and she stood on the new porch and looked at the railing and the decking and the repaired steps. And she stood there long enough that he knew she was seeing all of it. Not just the lumber and the nails, but the 12 days of work and the intention behind them. The fact that he'd done it right when doing it adequately would have satisfied any practical requirement. She turned and looked at him. "Come up here," she said. He stepped up onto the porch. They stood side by side and looked out at the yard, at the barn beyond it, at the western pasture where the new grass had come in strong through the burned section and was now cured to winter gold, at the fence line along the western edge standing straight and deep set, at the creek visible in the distance with its east bend catching what thin October light remained. "There's nowhere else I want to be," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way true things sometimes do. Not in response to anything specific, just arriving because it was ready to be said. Clara didn't look at him immediately. She kept looking at the land for a moment longer, the way she looked at things she wanted to fully see before she responded to them. Then she said, "Good." Just that. And it was the right thing to say, and the right amount of words to say it in, and the October evening settled around them in the particular way evenings do, when the day has been honest and the work has been good, and the people standing in it are where they chose to be. The years that followed were not simple. That needs to be said plainly, because stories about people who survive hardship and find their footing tend toward the implication that surviving the hard part means the rest comes easier, and that isn't true. And it wasn't true for Wade and Clara Mercer. There were dry years and wet years, years when the cattle prices dropped, and the numbers in the cash book were uncomfortable, years when the work pressed so hard from every direction that there wasn't much left over for anything except getting through the week. There was a year when they lost 30 head to a fever that moved through the valley in late spring, and they sat at the kitchen table after the count was confirmed, and neither of them said much because there wasn't much useful to say. They just looked at the number and then looked at each other and then got up and started working out what to do next, which was all you could do. There was a winter, 2 years in, when the second well collapsed entirely despite the repair work, and they had to carry water by hand through January until the ground softened enough to dig, and by February Clara's hands were cracked deep enough at the knuckles that they bled every cold morning for 3 weeks, and she never said a word about it. And Wade saw it and also said nothing, and just made sure there was warm water ready before she needed it, which was the kind of small practical care that sounds minor in the telling and is not minor in the living. There were arguments. Not many, but real ones. The kind that come when two people with strong and specific opinions about how things should be done discover that their specific opinions occasionally point in different directions. The worst one was about money, about whether to spend what they'd saved on a land expansion opportunity that came up in the 3rd year when a neighboring parcel went to estate sale. Wade wanted to bid. Clara thought the timing was wrong. They argued it for 4 days with the particular stubbornness of two people who each had good reasons and knew the other person had good reasons too, which is the worst kind of argument to be in because you can't dismiss the other person's position. Clara won. She was right. The timing was wrong. The parcel would have stretched their cash position through a drought year, and they would have been back in the position they'd fought so hard to get out of. Wade acknowledged she was right when the numbers came in that summer, and he didn't have any difficulty acknowledging it, which surprised him slightly and didn't surprise Clara at all. "You're not a man who needs to be right more than you need to be correct," she told him. "That's unusual." "I've been wrong too many times to protect a position that doesn't hold up," he said. "Most people learn the opposite from being wrong," she said. He thought about that. "Most people learn from being wrong that being wrong is dangerous. I learned it's just information." Clara looked at him for a moment. "I'm going to write that down," she said. "Don't," he said. She wrote it down anyway. He found it in the back of the cash book 2 weeks later in her careful handwriting, and he left it there, and he didn't say anything about finding it. In the spring of the 4th year, Curtis came back. He'd left at the end of his 2nd summer to work a larger operation near Dodge, which had been the right move for him, and he'd learned things there that he couldn't have learned on a smaller ranch. and he came back to Copper Hollow with those things learned and a different quality about him. Not the uncertainty he'd carried at 21, but not the false confidence that sometimes replaces uncertainty in young men who mistake the end of doubt for the beginning of knowledge. He came to the Mercer ranch specifically. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and told Wade he'd been thinking about the conversation in August 2 years ago, the one where Wade had told him to trust his instincts with cattle, and that he'd been thinking about whether he wanted to work for a large operation the rest of his working life or whether he wanted to learn to build something. Wade listened to all of it. Then he said, "We've been thinking about taking on a permanent hand." Curtis looked up. "The terms are fair," Wade said. "The work is real. And if you're good at what you do, I'll teach you everything I know about building a cattle operation that can survive a bad year." He paused. "That last part is the offer most outfits don't make." Curtis was quiet for a moment. "Why do you make it?" "Because someone would have saved me 10 years of drifting if they'd done the same for me," Wade said. "And because a good hand who understands the whole operation is worth 3 hands who just know their particular job." Curtis came on at the beginning of April. By June, Clara was giving him ledger work to cross-check, which was her way of indicating that she thought he could handle more than the cattle work, and which startled him considerably the first time it happened. "You're testing me," he told her, not with resentment but with the directness of someone who respects directness in others. "I'm giving you the opportunity to test yourself," Clara said. "There's a difference." She put the cash book in front of him. "The April hay purchase numbers should balance against the receipt in the tin box. Tell me if they don't." They didn't by $11.40, which turned out to be a supplier error that Clara had already identified but hadn't corrected yet. Curtis found it in 20 minutes, which was faster than she'd expected, and she told him so. "You expected it to take longer?" he said. "I expected you to not find it at all," she said honestly. "Which means I underestimated you." He thought about that. "You say that like it's comfortable to admit." "It's accurate," she said. "Accuracy is more useful than comfort." Curtis looked at the cash book for a moment. "Mr. Mercer says things like that." "We've been talking to each other for years," Clara said. "Some of it gets in." The letter from Prescott's bank came on a Thursday morning in the 5th year. Clara opened it at the kitchen table while Wade was outside checking the cattle count with Curtis, and she read it twice, and then she sat with it for a while in the particular stillness that accompanies the arrival of something you've been working toward for so long that its arrival requires a moment to be real. The note was paid. Completely, finally, irrevocably paid. The bank confirmed the account was closed, the lien was released, the property was theirs without encumbrance. Prescott had written the letter himself rather than having his clerk do it, which was itself a form of acknowledgement, and he had used more words than necessary, which in a man like Prescott was the equivalent of a lengthy tribute. Clara folded the letter carefully. She walked outside and across the yard to where Wade and Curtis were working at the south pasture gate. She waited until Curtis had moved on to the next section with his count. She held the letter out. Wade took it. Read it. He was not a demonstrative man, and she was not a demonstrative woman, and what passed between them when he looked up from the paper was not something that would have been legible to a stranger. But it was complete and specific and full of everything that had gone into arriving at this morning, the fire and the fence and the bank meetings and the torn agreement and 12 days of porch building, and the argument about the land parcel, and the 30 head of cattle lost to fever, and Curtis finding an $11 error in the April receipts, and all of it, every piece of it, present in the 2 seconds they looked at each other. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. He handed the letter back. She put it in her apron pocket. They went back to work. That evening, after supper, after Curtis had gone to the bunkhouse they'd built the previous year, Wade went out to the porch. The porch he'd built. The one that drained properly and had deep-set posts and a railing that had not moved in 4 years of Kansas weather. He sat on the top step and looked at the yard. The barn was lit from inside where one of the lanterns was still burning, which meant Curtis was doing the evening check on the 3 cows they were watching for early calving. The western pasture was dark beyond the fence line, the fence that was still standing at the depth he'd set it, and beyond the fence the burned section that had grown back so completely in 4 years that you had to know it had happened to see any evidence of it in the grass. The creek was quiet in the distance. Running. It was always running now. The past 4 years had averaged out to reasonable rainfall, and the spring-fed bend held its depth even in the dry weeks, just as Gell's survey had documented, and the boundary markers confirmed and the county record showed, and the Halverson and Denny cattle had demonstrated twice a week during the hard September 2 years ago. Clara came out and sat beside him on the step. She didn't bring anything. No coffee, no lamp, no pretense of another purpose. She just came out and sat down, close enough that their shoulders touched, and looked at the same yard he was looking at. They sat like that for a while. "I've been thinking," Wade said, "about what I would have done if you'd said no." "No to what?" "To the refinancing, if Prescott had turned us down the second time." Clara thought about it. "I would have found another way." "What way?" "I don't know," she said, "but I would have found one. I wasn't going to let this ranch go." She paused. "What would you have done?" He was quiet for a moment. "Probably helped you find the other way." She looked at him sideways. "Even then?" she said. "Even then," he said. "I'd already decided by then." He looked at the yard. "Probably decided before I knew I'd decided." Clara considered that. "The night you sat against the barn wall." "Maybe earlier," he said. "Maybe when you set that bucket down and looked at me from across the yard like you were checking the load capacity of something before you committed to carrying it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I was," she said. "I know you were. And you didn't mind." "I thought it was the most sensible thing I'd ever seen someone do," he said. "Ask the real questions before making the commitment instead of after." The evening was cool and still, the kind of stillness that comes to Kansas in early autumn when the wind has decided to take the evening off for once. Somewhere in the distance, one of the cattle made a low sound that carried easily across the quiet yard. Not distress, just a cow being a cow in the dark, which was one of the sounds that had become part of what this place sounded like at night. "I want to write to Arthur Gell," Clara said. "Send him something, a proper thank you. It's been 5 years. A thank you doesn't have an expiration date." She paused. "He was nervous, you remember. He said the findings were correct, but he was nervous about filing in this county where Crowder had influence. He filed anyway." "He did his job," Wade said. "He did his job when it would have been easier not to," Clara said. "That's more than his job." Wade thought about that. "I'll draft the letter if you want. You can revise it." "You'll draft it, and I'll send it as written," she said. "Your letters are better than mine. Your letters are perfectly fine." "My letters are accurate," she said. "Yours are accurate, and also make the recipient feel that someone considered them specifically. That's different." He didn't argue with her. She was right. They sat on the porch he'd built in the cold October light, and the cattle were settled, and the fence was standing, and the creek was running inside the boundary that was theirs by documented law and by 5 years of daily effort, and the bank debt was paid, and the note was closed, and the ranch was theirs in the full weight of that word. Not temporarily, not contingently, not by the grace of some extension or arrangement or patience of a creditor, but completely and permanently and truly theirs. And Wade Mercer, who had arrived at this gate on an October evening 5 years ago with $40 in his pocket and no address, and the road's particular flavor of nowhere settled into his bones, sat on the step he'd built with wood he'd chosen and nails he'd driven. And he looked at what they had made, what they had kept, what they had fought for and paid for, and built together from the wreckage of a desperate arrangement into something that had no better name than home. He had spent 32 years repairing other people's fences. He had spent 5 years building his own. The difference between those two things was not something he could have explained easily to a man who hadn't lived both sides of it, but it had to do with who the work was for, and whether you left at the end of the season, and whether the fence you drove into the ground was going to matter to you in the spring when the ground softened and the posts either held or they didn't. His held. He looked at Clara beside him on the step. She was looking at the creek in the distance. That creek, that specific water, that recorded boundary, that spring-fed bend that had started all of it, with the expression she wore when she was satisfied, which was not a happy expression exactly, but was something quieter and more durable than happiness. The look of a person who has done the thing they set out to do and has done it without flinching. She had set out to save this ranch. It was saved. She had set out to find someone worth trusting with it. He was sitting beside her on the porch he'd built. Some things worked out. Not cleanly, not without cost, Not without the 30 head of cattle, and the broken well, and the arguments, and the fire, and the fear, and the long nights when the numbers didn't add up, and the longer nights when the numbers added up fine, but the weight of everything that might still go wrong sat on your chest like something physical. But they worked out. And the working out was not magic or luck, or the intervention of anything outside the two of them. It was the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions to stay, to work, to be honest, to show up the next morning when the previous day had been bad, to choose the right thing when the easy thing was available. That was all. That was, it turned out, everything. The creek ran in the distance, in the dark, inside their boundary, and the porch held their weight, and the stars came out over Kansas the way they always did. All at once, committing fully, the whole sky going from suggestion to certainty in the space of 20 minutes. Wade looked up at them. 32 years of those stars from bunkhouses and campfires and barn walls, and the open ground of a dozen different counties. And they had always looked the same. And they looked the same now. And the only thing different was what he was looking at them from. He was looking at them from home. That was the whole difference. That was enough.